This? Oh, this is a big fucking gun.
You're not gonna do what you paid me to do.
When Prohibition finally died in the early 1930s, it didn't leave quietly. It left behind a nation soaked in corruption, a system so thoroughly compromised that its fingerprints are still visible today. Out of that mess rose something bigger than anyone expected. A criminal empire that could make or break politicians, decide elections, and move the machinery of America from the shadows. By the 1960s, the newspapers had a name for it: the Italian-American Mafia. But that label was too small. This wasn't just Italian. It was a coalition: Italians, Jews, Irish, men from immigrant streets who'd been treated like outsiders and decided to build their own power. Together, they took over entire industries. When Prohibition ended, they moved fast. America was shifting its muscle from railroads to trucking, and the mob understood before anyone else what that meant. Whoever controlled trucking controlled the arteries of commerce. They stepped in under the banner of union leadership, talking about wages, pensions, and workers' rights, but they were running a racket. The unions became fronts, the contracts and pension funds new tools of extortion and control. By 1948, they were playing a much bigger game. That was the year Jimmy Hoffa and Jewish mob figures helped smuggle weapons past embargoes to arm the newborn state of Israel. They'd gone global. Through the 50s and into the 60s, mob pipelines fed CIA covert ops, shipped guns to Cuban rebels, and kept Israel's military supplied. They weren't just writing history anymore, they were helping write it. No one embodied this new era more than Jimmy Hoffa. Born out of Detroit's industrial boom, he spoke for the working man and built the Teamsters into a juggernaut. But Hoffa's public crusade masked a darker alliance. The mob didn't just support him, they needed him. Through Hoffa, they had their hands on the Teamsters' pension fund, a billion-dollar slush pile they used like their own private bank. Casinos, hotels, and whole industries rose on that money. And when businesses teetered, the mob used the fund to bail them out, then quietly took control. In return, Hoffa got muscle. Dissent inside the union didn't last long when gangsters were handling the opposition. The mob legitimized its money through the union, and Hoffa cemented his empire. But that visibility brought heat. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, made Hoffa his personal crusade. The investigations into labor racketeering were relentless. By 1967, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering, fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 13 years in Lewisburg Penitentiary, a federal lockup notorious for housing mob bosses. Hoffa hated every minute of it. The isolation burned him, and he despised being paraded before visitors like some kind of trophy inmate. But the Kennedys had been after him since 1961, and Robert Kennedy had made him the face of labor corruption during the McClellan hearings. The evidence piled up: mob infiltration of unions, Teamster pension money funding illegal schemes, and an FBI that had ignored warnings for decades. J. Edgar Hoover had famously claimed the Mafia didn't even exist, all while meeting mob boss Frank Costello in Manhattan restaurants. It wasn't until Joe Valachi flipped in 1963 that Washington could no longer deny it. With Hoffa behind bars, men who had once needed his nod to steal millions were now poised to steal hundreds of millions without him. The mob had been shaping labor since the Depression. When the market crashed in 1929, unions were wiped out, broke, unable to meet pension obligations. The Mafia stepped in with cash. They saved the unions, but took control of them in the process. It wasn't charity. It was strategy. The unions became tools for laundering money, buying influence, and muscling into legitimate industries. Trucking was the key. America's economy depended on it, and the mob owned it. Lucky Luciano and the syndicates had mastered transportation during Prohibition, and now they moved anything. Narcotics, weapons, people, through networks built for legitimate commerce. Dock workers on the coasts answered them. Southern routes were mob territory. Louisiana, Kansas, Texas, Florida, all carved up and run by families like Carlos Marcello's in New Orleans and Santo Traficante's in Tampa. They had warehouses full of stolen World War II weapons and access to stockpiles the government had forgotten about. Transportation wasn't just an industry. It was the bloodstream of the underworld. With that control came leverage. They could dictate labor markets, siphon union cash, and control industries from the inside. Luciano, and later Russell Bufalino, cut deals that ensured cheap labor for mob-linked businesses and extended their reach into sectors untouched by the unions. The mob had gone from bootlegging beer to shaping the American economy. Hoffa hadn't built the Teamsters from scratch, but under him it became a political force. And prison brought him face to face with one of the most feared mobsters in America, Anthony "Tony Pro" Provenzano. A Genovese captain with his own faction, Tony Pro was respected across the board by New York's 5 families, Marcello in Louisiana, Traficante in Florida, Bufalino in Pennsylvania, and names like Fat Tony Salerno and Vito Genovese. He was tied to the Kennedy assassination in rumor and suspected Hoffa's own disappearance years later. Inside Lewisburg, Hoffa and Tony Pro clashed. Tony wanted Hoffa's help recovering his lost pension, millions in today's money. Hoffa brushed him off, hiding behind union rules and throwing Tony's criminal record back in his face. Tony was furious. To him, Hoffa was just a mouthpiece. The Italians and Jews had built the unions. They'd provided the money, the muscle, the reach. If they could make Hoffa, they could unmake him. Outside, Marcello and Bufalino were already working to get Hoffa out. They tried to flip Ed Partin, a key witness, then turned to politics. Their plan was simple. Put someone in the White House who'd grant Hoffa a pardon. They threw their weight behind Richard Nixon. When Nixon won, the path cleared. Hoffa's freedom would cost $500,000, half from Marcello, the rest from Bufalino, and skim money out of Las Vegas. The world kept spinning while Hoffa sat in his cell. In 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated within weeks of each other. Hoffa's reaction was telling. When John Kennedy was shot in '63, Hoffa reportedly called mob lawyer Frank Costello and said, "They finally got the son of a bitch." But Robert Kennedy's death left him quiet and withdrawn. Maybe it was the weight of the violence. Maybe it was the realization that the world outside had changed in ways even he couldn't control. The killings weren't limited to politics. The underworld was bleeding too. On June 28, 1971, Joe Colombo was shot in the head at a public rally. The gunman was immediately gunned down by someone else. The Patsy method, as they called it in Louisiana. It was how they tied up loose ends in the murders of Huey Long in 1936 and, many believed, John F. Kennedy in 1963. By the 1970s, America was waking up to the scale of what the mob had built. Hoover's denial looked absurd now. CIA Mafia connections, whispers of Cuban gunmen in Dallas, and Jim Garrison's probe into Kennedy's death all dragged the underworld into the public conversation. The Mafia wasn't just a crime problem anymore. It was part of the architecture of American power. and Jimmy Hoffa sitting in a prison cell was both a symbol of that power and a casualty of it. America didn't fall into the hands of the few overnight. It happened slowly, methodically, with one institution after another swallowed whole. The press was one of the first. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, newspapers were everywhere, thousands of them, each with its own voice, each owned by someone different. They covered local politics, national affairs, the things that mattered to the people who read them. And the people were doing well. Steady jobs, union protection, 2 cars in the garage, a mortgage paid off, kids headed to good public schools. They had time to think, to read, to question, and they started asking questions about everything, including their own government. J. Edgar Hoover swore organized crime didn't exist. Then Robert F. Kennedy blew that lie apart on October 25th, 1963. 3 weeks later, a US president was dead in Dallas, and America's world cracked open. The Warren Report landed in 64 and smothered doubts for a while. But by 66, Rush to Judgment was in print, and a year later, its documentary version aired. The public began to see Kennedy's murder differently. Dallas radio hosts started talking to witnesses the Warren Commission had misquoted or ignored. Testimonies had been altered, questions scrubbed from the record. People, especially in Dallas, stopped believing. They looked harder. And behind the curtain, in that same year, the most powerful men in organized crime were having a quiet sit-down in a New York restaurant, business as usual. By the early 60s, Kennedy was sniffing around something poisonous, a shadowy relationship between the US government and organized crime. In the South, especially New Orleans, the roots went deep, back to the 1870s. By the early 1900s, local families controlled the city. They were about to make a new kind of alliance. His name was Sam Zemurray, a Russian Jew who landed in the American South and built an empire from bananas. By 1935, Zemurray, the Banana King, was richer than the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. He controlled nearly half of the land in countries like Colombia, Guatemala, and Honduras, with reach into Cuba. A fierce anti-communist and an ardent Zionist, he settled in Louisiana and turned United Fruit Company into a monster. In the 1930s, Zemurray brought in 2 brilliant lawyers, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. They helped United Fruit pull off coups across Central America and make it all look legal. In the process, they laid the groundwork for what would become the CIA. While Europe tore itself apart in war, Hitler bombing cities, and Britain fighting for survival, Franklin D. Roosevelt knew Pearl Harbor was coming and let it happen. A calculated move to pull America into the fight against fascism. FDR died in office. 3 years later, in 1948, Zemurray and other Zionists got what they'd fought for, the creation of the State of Israel. It was just the beginning. Now the mission was bigger, the so-called Greater Israel Project. It would take power, money, force, and organized crime was the perfect partner. America had always been built on clashing ideologies, but none more radical than Christian Zionism. These believers wanted a Jewish state in Israel to fulfill biblical prophecy. And in their eyes, America was expendable. Israel was all that mattered. They'd tear down anything, even the United States itself, to see that prophecy realized. For Jewish Zionists, the goal was land, power, and control over the Middle East. For Christian Zionists, it was Scripture fulfilled. Both had the networks to make it happen. They planned to crush organized crime and seize everything the mob had built. But they underestimated the men they were dealing with. Sicilians and their allies, raised on vendetta and omerta, who'd rather die than bend. They'd proven it in 1891, when Sicilians were lynched in New Orleans and the code held. By the 1930s, America's corporate boardrooms had a silent partner: organized crime. They needed each other. Business leaders wanted distance from the dirty work. The mob provided it. Charles "Lucky" Luciano built the structure, La Cosa Nostra, the Commission, a syndicate run like a Fortune 500 company with muscle in the streets. Luciano was more than a gangster. He was an architect. As the Great Depression crushed the country, banks and factories dried up. The mob stepped in with cash, bailing out businesses the way Washington would bail out Wall Street decades later. Organized crime became a shadow economy with corporate reach. They ran unions, controlled ports, dictated terms in trucking and shipping, and extended their influence into Central America, Guatemala, Cuba, anywhere American industry needed muscle. Murder, intimidation, silencing the press. The mob handled it all. World War II tightened the bond. In 1942, with America now in the fight, the War Department feared Nazi saboteurs had infiltrated East Coast docks. The troopship Normandy had already burned and sunk at its Manhattan berth. A Navy officer floated an idea: use the Mafia. Naval intelligence made a deal with Meyer Lansky, Luciano's right hand. Luciano had seized control of the American Mafia in 1931, wiping out the old guard in a bloody purge. Lansky modernized the organization, but when Luciano went to prison in 1936 on a 50-year sentence, the old Sicilian bosses dismissed Lansky as an outsider. The Navy deal changed that. Luciano ordered mob soldiers to patrol the waterfront in exchange for his release. Thomas Dewey, the prosecutor who had locked Luciano up and rode that victory to the governor's mansion, now agreed to the deal. Luciano was moved from the icy isolation of Dannemora to a cushier prison near Albany. Shortly after VE Day, Dewey signed his parole. By then, the Mafia had forged a friendship with America's first intelligence agency, the Office of Strategic Services. The OSS Mafia deal, Operation Underworld, even extended to the Allied invasion of Sicily. When the war ended and the OSS was disbanded in 1945, both the Mafia and a circle of well-connected politicians, businessmen and spies were furious. They wanted it back. Allen Dulles, a top OSS man, and Governor Dewey led that circle. With John Foster Dulles, Allen's brother and mentor, they lobbied to resurrect America's intelligence machine. Truman listened. In 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act. The CIA was born. The Cold War followed, and communism became the new enemy. The CIA's mission: protect America and American business Mafia by any means necessary. The Mafia, now global, was part of that mission. Lansky's work freeing Luciano impressed the Sicilian dons. Luciano, deported to Sicily after his release, gave Lansky full control of U.S. operations. Lansky built the International Crime Syndicate, a network bigger than U.S. Steel, spread across banking, real estate, tourism, and gambling. Luciano expanded overseas ties. When communist dockworkers shut down the French port of Marcello in 1947, threatening American shipping, the CIA called Luciano. He sent in killers. The CIA sent cash and weapons. After a few bodies dropped, the docks reopened, for American goods and syndicate heroin alike. The CIA learned fast. Deals with criminals were legal under its charter, but the agency feared Washington more than the mob. Congress could choke its power. So Dulles and Dewey built political insurance. They funneled money, staff, and campaign help to promising young congressmen. One of them was Richard Nixon. In 1947, Nixon backed the creation of the CIA. Dewey liked Nixon's ruthless pragmatism and ferocious anti-communism. In 1948, Dewey leaked CIA secrets about Al-Jahis to Nixon, launching him into the national spotlight. In 1950, Nixon ran for the Senate, branding his opponent, Helen Douglas, the Pink Lady, with information lifted from CIA files. He won. By 1952, Nixon was vice president, handpicked by Eisenhower on Dewey's advice. Allen Dulles became CIA director, and John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State. The Justice Department now looked the other way on Meyer Lansky. A tax evasion case in 1953 vanished. A deportation attempt in 1957 fizzled. Lansky, Nixon, and Dulles all thrived, until Cuba changed everything. Lansky had gone to Havana in 1933 and befriended Fulgencio Batista, a sergeant-turned-dictator. With Batista's blessing, he opened casinos, the start of the mob's global gambling network. World War II killed tourism, and Batista lost power. Fearing communist gains, U.S. corporations panicked. Naval intelligence leaned on Lansky to push Batista toward elections. He did. A pro-American candidate won, and Batista went into exile in Florida. In Congress, Nixon grew close to Miami Congressman George Smathers and his circle of fast-buck operators, ex-FBI man Richard Danner and Charles Bieber Rebozo. In March 1952, Batista staged a bloodless coup, greased by Lansky's $250,000 bribe. A month later, Danner gave Nixon a tour of Havana's casinos. Under Batista, Lansky's new hotel casinos raked in $100 million a year. By the mid-1950s, Howard Hughes was in the mix too, a defense contractor under fire for wartime influence peddling. Hughes started hiring ex-CIA men and became the agency's biggest private contractor, buying himself protection. In 1956, he secretly gave Nixon $100,000 to fend off a Republican revolt. Later that year, he loaned $205,000 to Nixon's brother for a hamburger stand. The loan was never repaid. Soon after, an antitrust case against Hughes vanished, and his foundation got a long-denied tax exemption worth $30 million a year. The ties tightened. Then, in 1958, a bearded lawyer named Fidel Castro marched down from the Sierra Maestra and shouted, "Yankee, go home." Lansky armed Batista, but on New Year's Day 1959, Castro seized Havana. Batista fled. So did Lansky. At CIA headquarters in Langley, plans to retake Cuba began immediately, to protect U.S. business, to stop communism, and to win back the mob's lost empire. Lansky had perfected a system to skim casino profits, launder money, and hide payments, a system the CIA used to move money to its criminal contractors. The plan was simple. 1,200 Cuban exiles would land at the Bay of Pigs, slip through the jungle, and set up a puppet government, a pretext for a U.S. invasion. E. Howard Hunt, the CIA man running the operation, later said Nixon was the White House's secret action officer for the mission. Alongside the invasion came a darker plan: kill Castro. The CIA hired Robert Maheu, a former FBI agent on its payroll since 1954. Maheu brought in the heavy hitters, John Roselli, Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficante. Johnson would later admit, "We're operating a damn murder incorporated in the Caribbean." The attempts failed, and Nixon lost the 1960 election. The plan's future now depended on John F. Kennedy, who was handed the Bay of Pigs invasion as a fait accompli. But by 1962, the world shifted. The Kennedy brothers wanted it all exposed. Robert Kennedy turned the Justice Department into a battering ram aimed squarely at organized crime. And the CIA, watching what the mob had built, decided it wanted the whole apparatus for itself. The agency saw more than rackets. It saw infrastructure, casinos, laundering networks, global transportation hubs, drug pipelines, political contacts, foreign leaders who answered the phone when the Mafia called. Piece by piece, the CIA wrapped itself around the mob's operations like a parasite. To absorb it all, They first had to cripple it. Then came Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. President John Kennedy was shot dead. Investigators would find trail after trail leading back to Carlos Marcello, the short, sharp boss of New Orleans. Marcello had his own reasons, a personal vendetta against the Kennedys. But he wasn't acting alone. He had backing from men with power far beyond the underworld. The elites who had used the mob for decades still needed it to solve problems. And the Kennedys were a problem. Russell Bufalino came up out of coal country. He knew the grind, the dust, the way a shift could swallow a man whole. Jimmy Hoffa understood it too. His father died in a mine. That death became the motor inside him, the reason he pushed for wages, benefits, pensions, the reason he never stopped pushing. By the early 50s, Hoffa was climbing. He built alliances the way other men built routes. Bufalino in Pennsylvania, the Detroit crowd at home, the Chicago outfit when reach mattered more than ceremony. The deals were quiet and efficient. No fireworks, just territory added, contracts locked, money moving. Power spread without a fight because everyone was eating. The underworld around them wasn't calm. In 1951, the Mangano brothers vanished, and the old map didn't make sense anymore. Luciano would later say Anastasia's family quadrupled in size off that chaos, too big to steer cleanly, but suddenly everywhere. The Manganos had union muscle. Anastasia inherited it. Meanwhile, Carlo Gambino stayed low, built patiently, and never set off alarms. The real turn came when Anastasia was hit, 3 weeks before Appalachian, an execution that rewired the board. Under it all, Gambino and Vito Genovese were edging against each other, contest by contest, city by city. Hoffa's rise sat right in that shuffle. Bufalino backed him. So did friends in Detroit and Chicago. The mob's angle wasn't hard to read. Unions meant pension funds, and pension funds meant loans. By 57, they were hunting for a bank with no forms. After the attempt on Frank Costello and the gambling stink that came with it, legitimate lenders demanded magnifying glasses and strings. Money dried up just as the outfit needed it most. The Castro years, 57 to 59, tightened the belt further. New funding had to come from inside. Hoffa had the keys. They would have preferred to stay ghosts. Before Appalachian, a dirty union fixer was just that. A crook in a suit, not a soldier in an invisible army. The meeting in upstate New York blew the cover. After that, union problem translated to Mafia on the front page. The facade cracked. Every handshake looked like a shakedown. Unions still fronted the money pipelines, but exposure raised the cost of doing business and welded crime, labor, and politics into one headline. 6 days before Appalachian, November 9th, 1957, Hoffa was already starring in the coverage. In Los Angeles, the Teamsters General Executive Board tried to outrun bad press by hopscotching hotel suites like farce actors. They looked like a corporate retreat, but they were fighting for the right to stay inside the AFL-CIO. The case against them was simple. Corruption had migrated from rumor to rap sheet. Dave Beck was bellowing about tax vendettas. Sidney L. Brennan had a bribery conviction. Frank Brewster had a contempt conviction. And there was James Riddle Hoffa, 5'5½", 170 pounds, staring down the law and inching toward the big chair. "I have been as clean as anybody else in the labor movement," he said. "What I have done was in keeping with the membership's authority vested in me." Hoffa had built a machine one local at a time. Business agents, stewards, small bosses, who owed him personally. He sold himself as a contract killer in the lawful sense, the man who got the deal. He also sold himself as a reformer. "Within the Teamsters, we have no room for dishonest people," he told a St. Louis luncheon crowd. He even lectured at Harvard about collective bargaining, the same year he was dodging indictments and headlines. The origin story traveled with him because it played. Indiana coal fields, a father who tested ore with his teeth and died with dust in his lungs, a mother, Viola, who beat poverty by scrubbing laundry while her boys hauled baskets in a wagon. Detroit came next. Hustles came with it. Ashes one day, handbills the next. Jimmy dropped out after 9th grade and found regular work at Kroger, unloading boxcars, for 32 cents an hour. Paid for hours worked, not hours waited, he organized a strike in 1932. He timed it to a shipment of strawberries and cantaloupes. The company blinked before the fruit spoiled. Small raise, insurance on the table, and a first taste of leverage that stayed with him. He moved his crew into the Teamsters, took over debt-soaked Local 299 as trustee, and lived on picket lines. "I was picked up 18 times in 24 hours, he said later. Every time I went back. He met Josephine Posiwak on a line. They married in 36 and had 2 kids. He took beatings, took arrests, and kept gaining ground. By 1940, he was negotiating chief for the Central States Drivers' Council, 12 states, million-dollar stakes, while Dan Tobin, the aging international president, was more portrait than presence. There were dents. In 42, a $1,000 fine for a paper company restraint of trade conspiracy. In 46, an indictment that ended with him paying $500 in costs for squeezing fees out of independents who hauled their own goods. Politics didn't love him. Precinct losses, tossed petitions, failed plays in 48 and 54. Inside the union was different. He hitched to Dave Beck, helped nudge Tobin into retirement in 1952, and collected his reward: vice president, near total autonomy in the Central States, and trusteeships over 16 locals. He could sit at a table for 36 hours and carve out a settlement the industry could live with, and his members could feel. Management respected him because he knew their books and never asked for money that didn't exist. "When you finish with Hoffa, you can sleep," one negotiator said. "With Ruther, the trouble is beginning." The city noticed too. At a $100 a plate dinner for his 25 years in labor, proceeds to a children's home in Israel, 2,600 people lined up to shake his hand. Big automakers sent vice presidents, even though the Teamsters had maybe 500 of their workers. They still trucked the cars, and that was enough. The other side of the ledger was open in pen. He leaned on Johnny Dio in New York to topple old guard leaders and install John O'Rourke at Joint Council 16. He borrowed money from employers with union contracts. He drove enemies out of locals that wouldn't fall in line. When lawyer John Cy Cheesty said Hoffa hired him to spy on the Senate Rackets Committee, Hoffa beat the bribery case, with Joe Lewis sitting in the courtroom, and then took the Fifth's little cousin, I don't recall, for a long walk before McClellan. Cheesty swore Hoffa gave him a throat-slit gesture when the jury wasn't looking. Message received. His private life was plain. Same brick house in northwest Detroit since 1939. White socks, because colored ones make my feet sweat. And novices. No smoke, no booze, no women, not even coffee. Work was the drug. He'd pace a floor, bark into 4 phones, and talk big strategy. Big labor, with big business. No room for small anything. "I don't have any college boys," he liked to say. "I don't need them." The rank and file mostly stayed quiet. Some cursed him. Some called him a go-through guy. More than a few stared at the river and said they preferred not to end up in it. His critics, Gus Scholler in Michigan, lawyers out west, called him what he was: ruthless. Beck, they said, would rant and shove. Hoffa wouldn't stop at anything. Hoffa said he'd modernize the Constitution, shift authority to the board he controlled, tighten international oversight of local finances, dump private business interests to appease the AFL-CIO, defend any official's right to plead the Fifth, and build a loose-knit council of all transport unions. A national thumbscrew if he ever turned it. The engine inside him never needed polishing. I talked and they listened, he said, after mediating a newspaper strike at 3 a.m. He liked that feeling authority sealed with a nod. When he handed out pension checks for the first time in Teamster history, old people cried and kissed him. That, he said, was the payoff you couldn't buy. Through it all, Bufalino's shadow stayed close. Coal to coal. Credibility with working men that couldn't be faked. Together, with Detroit backing and outfit cash when necessary, they kept the peace where peace paid and pushed where push paid more. The killings and disappearances rearranged the Mafia's skyline, but the plan didn't change. Keep the headlines away, keep the loans flowing, use the union's legitimacy to fund what the banks wouldn't touch, and let Hoffa be the face the public could argue about. Appalachian changed the lighting. It didn't change the work. The country now knew the vocabulary, who the bosses were, what a meeting meant, how a union could be a bank. But the old motive stayed. Money in, money out, and a pension promise that made America's elderly less afraid of the mailbox. Say what you wanted about Jimmy Hoffa, ruthless, relentless, wired to win. He raised standards, forced better contracts, and put checks in hands that had never held them. That was the bargain of the age. Labor lifted, power consolidated, and the line between the two kept just blurry enough to hold. The power nexus behind that moment reached into places most Americans never heard of. It touched Life magazine, the publication that bought and controlled the Zapruder film, the clearest footage of Kennedy's murder. And it connected to Operation Tilt, a covert mission hatched in the winter of 1962. The story started with Eddie Bayo, born Eduardo Perez, who claimed 2 Soviet officers stationed in Cuba wanted to defect to the United States. They had secrets to trade, details about atomic warheads and missiles still on the island after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bayo's story traveled quickly through anti-Castro circles. Men like Nathaniel Weil, William Pawley, Jerry P. Hemming, John Martino, Felipe Vidal Santiago, and Frank Sturgis. Pawley pushed the CIA to act. Miami Station Chief Ted Shackley signed off and sent Rip Robertson to assist. David Sanchez Morales joined the operation. On June 8, 1963, Pawley, Bayo, Robertson, Virgilio Gonzalez, Eugenio Martinez, Martino, Richard Billings, and Terry Spencer, a Life magazine journalist, boarded a CIA flying boat. They landed off Baracoa, Cuba. Bayo and his team switched to a small 22-foot craft and vanished toward shore, planning to return with the defectors in 2 days. They never came back. Rumor said they'd been captured and executed. Havana never reported it. Many of the men tied to Operation Tilt, Martino among them, had deep mob connections, including to Santo Traficante Jr. and Carlos Marcello. They had tried to topple Fidel Castro, but Kennedy changed course, trading US missiles in Turkey for Soviet withdrawal from Cuba and steering toward détente. To the mob, the CIA, and a host of powerful men, peace was a threat. Robert Kennedy's crusade to dismantle organized crime was another. Life magazine's presence on that mission wasn't incidental. They had eyes on the raid, and later they had custody of the film that showed Kennedy's final seconds. The early story pushed after the assassination tried to pin it on Castro. But Lyndon Johnson got word from Moscow. The Soviets could prove Oswald wasn't theirs. They had even warned US intelligence that he was involved in plots against both Castro and Kennedy. Warnings that went ignored. Johnson had 3 options: call the bluff and go to war with Cuba, open an independent investigation, or join forces with Robert Kennedy and bury everything. The CIA's black operations, the mob's deals, the whole rotten pipeline. He chose the cover-up. Three years later, the underworld tried to recalibrate. The bosses gathered. Each had problems. Carlos Marcello faced unrest in his own family. Carlo Gambino was dealing with Tommy Lucchese's brain tumor. Joe Colombo had internal headaches of his own, including Sonny Francesi behind bars. The meeting itself passed without incident. It was the celebratory dinner afterward that didn't. Law enforcement swept in, raiding La Stella, a Queens restaurant, and putting the nation's most powerful mobsters in handcuffs. Carlo Gambino, head of the family that bore his name. Thomas Eboli and Mike Miranda of the Genovese family. Joseph Colombo. Agnello della Croce, Gambino underboss. Joseph N. Gallo, Gambino consigliere. Dominic Alongi, Eboli's driver. Anthony Cirillo, Genovese soldier. From Florida, Santo Trafficante Jr. From New Orleans, Carlos Marcello, his brother Joseph Marcello Jr., Anthony Carolla, and Frank Galliano. Even the restaurant's owners, Joseph and Jack Tagliaccio, were hauled in for questioning. Marcello, who had spent decades denying any connection to organized crime, was now photographed shoulder to shoulder with the Commission's most powerful figures. Gambino, Colombo, Della Croce, Trafficante. His lineage stretched back to the 1920s. Trafficante's father had been a major player before him. Marcello was paraded through New York in handcuffs and eventually released. But the damage was done. Investigators started connecting him to names that had hovered around Dallas in 1963. David Ferry, Guy Bannister, and a web of attorneys linked to Lee Harvey Oswald. Those threads led straight to Jack Ruby, the Dallas nightclub owner who killed Oswald, and a mob insider with ties reaching back to the Appalachian meeting of 1957. The dots were forming a picture: the mob, the CIA, anti-Castro exiles, political elites, and a president dead in Dallas. And in the middle of that storm stood Carlos Marcello. The same man who once barked, "I'm the boss here," was now part of a larger story, one where the bosses weren't always wearing fedoras or carrying .38s. Some of them wore suits and worked in Washington. Some wrote stories for Life magazine. And all of them understood the same thing Luciano had taught decades earlier. Power works best when it's shared in the dark. New Orleans, September 30th, 1966. The word was out. The little man was coming home. By 9:30 that night, Moisant International had gone quiet, except for Gate 19. A wall of cameras lined the concourse, pea shooters, TV crews from WWL and WDSU, stringers from every paper that mattered. A few men in plain clothes lingered near the rail, hands in their pockets, eyes fixed on the jetway. They weren't reporters. They were bureau. The Delta flight in from New York hissed to a stop. The cabin door opened, and there he was. Carlos Joseph Marcello, 56 years old, 5'4", neatly tailored and radiating the authority of a man who'd spent decades giving orders. His brother Joseph walked beside him, his son-in-law a step behind. They moved like they owned the floor. The flashbulbs hit before he cleared the gate. A mic shoved toward his face. "Any comment on your arrest in New York?" Marcello didn't slow. "What did you say?" he snapped. Louder now. "No comment to you or anybody else. Do you hear?" They followed him through Concourse B, cameras chewing film, questions flying. Marcello stopped, spun, and barked, "You got enough?" "You got enough goddamn pictures." Nobody moved. A beat later, the varnish peeled off. "Haven't you got enough pictures, you fucking sons of bitches? Get out of here. I'm the boss around here, you fucking bastards." Two men near the rail didn't flinch. They weren't there for quotes. One of them was Special Agent Patrick J. Collins, Jr. Marcello shoved forward. Move back! Move back! Bodies bounced off the guardrail. Collins, tall and in a white shirt, got pinned. Marcello squared up, swung his left arm once, then again, the second swipe grazing Collins across the chest and face. "Why don't you leave me alone?" Marcello spat. Collins didn't swing back. He just stared at him, face blank, until a Kenner cop muscled in. "That's enough. Break it up. Get to your cars." Marcello's party piled into a gold '66 Buick Riviera and vanished into the Louisiana night. Someone heard him roar one last shot over his shoulder. "You motherfuckers got enough pictures." The Bureau had been shadowing him since morning. 9:35 a.m., Queens County Courthouse, New York. They were parked in cars, leaning on lampposts, sitting in diners. Marcello moved slow and deliberate through the courthouse halls. At noon, he stopped for lunch at La Stella on Queens Boulevard, then went back to court. Nothing incriminating, nothing dramatic. But they logged everything. Who he spoke with, where he walked, stray remarks about football and the Giants. By 4:25 p.m., Marcello and his lawyer slipped into a black sedan that weaved through Queens into Manhattan. At 4:55, they entered the New York Hilton on 6th Avenue. Agents stayed on post until 6:15. Then the log went dry. Marcello not further observed. They knew why he was in town. It wasn't about hearings or football. Queens was hosting a sit-down. More than a dozen La Cosa Nostra bosses from across the country. A neutral ground summit. It didn't stay quiet. Authorities raided the meeting, hauling in 13 men, Marcello among them. He posted bond without a word and planned to fly home that night. At LaGuardia's Hangar 11, far from the cattle lines he despised, Marcello boarded a twin-engine aircraft southbound. 2 weeks later, the same plane touched down in New Orleans. The Bureau was waiting. "Mr. Marcello," one agent said, flashing a badge. "Federal officers? We'd like a word." Marcello stopped and smiled thinly. "You boys never get tired, do you?" They asked about New York, about parole violations. Marcello said nothing. His lawyer cut it off cold. "Unless you have a warrant, my client has nothing further to say." They didn't. Not yet. They backed off, but photographed everything. Marcello, his companions, the license plate of the car that carried him back to Tulane Farms, his guarded estate on the edge of New Orleans. Then he vanished behind the gates, surrounded by citrus groves and swamp silence. The message was clear both ways. Marcello wasn't backing down, and the Bureau wasn't going away. October 1st, 1966. The morning after the airport blow-up, the Bureau made its move. Collins filed his report. U.S. Attorney Louis C. LaCour signed off on prosecution under Title 18, Section 111, assaulting a federal officer. At 8:15 a.m., Collins and Special Agent Ernest C. Wall, Jr. knocked on Marcello's front door at 3117 Ridgeway Court, Metairie. "What do you want?" came the voice through the peephole. "Special agents of the FBI. We have a warrant for your arrest." Marcello said he needed to call his lawyer. Minutes later, he opened the door and went quietly. No fight, no theatrics. Just a stone-faced boss listening to his rights. He complained the flash attachments had hurt his eyes and humiliated him in front of his son. Yes, he'd swung his arm. No, he said, he hadn't struck anyone. The papers were mostly accurate. Someone might have been brushed, but it wasn't deliberate, he claimed. Before noon, he was in front of U.S. Commissioner Fritz Windhorst, who set bail at $50,000 and scheduled a preliminary hearing for October 7th. Marcello posted bond immediately. Federal marshals photographed him front and side, an official record of the night the little man swung at the Bureau. The government moved fast. They stacked Marcello's history page by page, a criminal resume stretching back nearly 4 decades. 1929. Accessory to assault and robbery in Algiers, Louisiana. 1930. Convicted of assault and robbery, 9 to 14 years. 1938. Violation of federal revenue laws. Transported and sold untaxed marijuana, 1 year and a day in Atlanta. 1944. Violation of the BPA Act. 1951. Refused to testify before a Senate committee. 1952 to 1961. Deportation fights, vagrancy arrests, perjury and fraud charges. 1961. Indicted for perjury and conspiracy against the U.S. Case collapsed by 1963. He had dodged deportation, tax charges, narcotics indictments. Now they were trying to nail him on a missed punch in an airport terminal. It looked simple. It wasn't. Marcello's power had been built from the swamps out, financed by bank loans $20,000 from Merchants Trust in 1976, $252,000 through Elmwood Plantation years earlier. Greased by bribes and union rackets deep into the 1970s. His rise wasn't luck. It was deliberate, transactional, ruthless. By the mid-1980s, with federal affidavits, taped calls, and mountains of evidence, the government finally had the case they'd chased for decades. Carlos Marcello, not just the boss of New Orleans, but a central figure in a national racketeering conspiracy. The case over that shove and swing refused to die. On October 7, 1966, Collins testified at the preliminary hearing. "Did he strike you, Agent Collins?" "He made contact, yes," Collins said, "and he was aiming for more. Probable cause found." Marcello was bound over. Bond dropped to $5,000. He didn't blink. The next day, October 8th, the grand jury indicted him under 18 U.S.C. Section 111. Racket's figure charged with slugging agent, the UPI wire read. Inside the bureau, the memos turned blunt. In view of Marcello's prominence as a national racketeer and La Cosa Nostra leader, this case must be closely followed. They tracked the calendar, pending over 6 months. Over 1 year. Pressure notes disguised as bookkeeping. Marcello pled not guilty before Judge Frederick J.R. Hebe on November 9, 1966. Defense asked for 45 days to file motions. They used everyone. 13 motions in all, attacking the grand jury, demanding discovery, pushing for a change of venue. Prosecutors tested the waters in Laredo, Texas. A single 6-inch UPI wire story on page 2 of the Laredo Times, October 7th. No TV, no radio. Still, the defense filed to move the trial. The bureau tightened the screws. Witness statements matched the film. The Kennecop's voice cut through the tape. "Break it up and get to your cars." An AP shooter swore Marcello's swing was absolutely unprovoked. And the words that had echoed through the concourse, "I'm the boss, no fucking pictures," stuck like evidence. The bureau's files swelled. Teletypes flew. Carlos Marcello indicted by federal grand jury. Report follows. New Orleans and New York swapped copies. The defense demanded the film. The prosecution chained Exhibit A to a clean statute and a clean chain of custody. Behind the court dates, the larger machine kept grinding. Headquarters sent background to the White House, describing Marcello as the leading hoodlum and racketeering figure in Louisiana, feared into compliance, tied to national bosses in New York, Kansas City, Florida. Even whispers from Dallas, unconfirmed, flagged as rumor, were logged. And through it all, one fact held. On a hot night in his own house, surrounded by cameras and a federal badge 10 feet away, Carlos Marcello let his temper write something the government could finally charge clean. For a man who'd built his life on distance and deniability, it was the first honest mistake. He gave them contact. And that, more than legend or rumor, put the little man in a fight he couldn't walk away from with a phone call. He was still on the street, still running his world, still dangerous when cornered. But now the Bureau had what the others lacked: timestamps, witnesses, and film. They didn't need Marcello to confess who he was. His own voice had done that for them. The rest was procedure. Push the indictment, beat the motions, seat the jury. And when the reel rolled in court, it would show 30 seconds that cut cleaner than any wiretap. The little man screaming, "I'm the boss here," and swinging at a badge. Carlos Marcello had spent a lifetime reminding everyone who was in charge. That night, he reminded the wrong people. By the mid-1960s, the official story of Dallas was starting to crack. Books like Rush to Judgment hit the shelves in '66, followed by a documentary the next year, and suddenly the country was looking at the Kennedy assassination through a different lens. People who had spoken to the Warren Commission began stepping forward again, this time telling a different story. They said their words had been changed, their questions rewritten, and entire sections left out. The picture they painted was darker and more complicated than the one Washington had sold. The threads started to connect. Jack Ruby, the strip club owner who shot Oswald on live TV. David Ferry, the eccentric pilot with a foot in both intelligence work and organized crime. Lee Harvey Oswald, handing out fair play for Cuba leaflets in New Orleans. Oswald seen going in and out of Guy Bannister's office, a private detective agency with deep ties to the far right and law enforcement. Oswald's time in the Civil Air Patrol with Ferry, his strange military record in Japan, his easy defection to the Soviet Union, and his even easier return, wife and child in tow. His friendship with lawyer Dean Andrews, and his regular meals in restaurants owned by Carlos Marcello, the mob boss of Louisiana. Witnesses surfaced with new details about that November day, where they were, who they saw, who else was there. The same names kept showing up: Ferry, Bannister Sergio Arcacha Smith, Louisiana's Cuban exile community, training camps tucked away in the swamps where marksmen practiced for missions to kill Fidel Castro, or maybe someone closer to home. Talk of a second Bay of Pigs invasion swirled. Then raids began across Louisiana, and Marcello's name appeared again and again, woven into the fabric of it all. Marcello was tied to nearly every man in the story. Ferry, Bannister, Ruby, and they were tied to each other. The excuse for federal scrutiny was Marcello's deportation fight, but J. Edgar Hoover knew better. He was certain the hit had come out of New Orleans, and Marcello was in the middle of it. The FBI moved fast. Marcello's people were under surveillance. Bannister was dead not long after the assassination. Marcello, always cautious, moved his next pieces into place. Then came Jim Garrison. The New Orleans district attorney opened his own investigation into the assassination in 1966. At first, Garrison's theory was bizarre. He told a journalist friend that Kennedy had been killed because of a homosexual conspiracy. Ruby, Ferry, Clay Shaw, and others. Kennedy, he said, was targeted because of his looks. Absurd as it sounded, that was his starting point. What Garrison didn't say publicly was how close he was to Marcello. He lived rent-free in a house owned by one of Marcello's captains. He received a monthly retainer, up to $5,000, from Marcello's illegal casinos. In 1962, Garrison told NBC that Marcello was a friend and a mentor, a man who'd taught him everything about politics. He repeated it in 1967, even as he was supposedly investigating the assassination. Ferry, Bannister, Arcacha Smith, Ruby, all had links to organized crime. Yet Marcello himself was untouched. Garrison never subpoenaed him, never interrogated him. Ferry's defense attorney was Marcello's personal lawyer. Garrison's crusade burned hot against the FBI, the CIA, and the media, but never against the boss of New Orleans. There was a reason. Marcello's war was bigger than Garrison's investigation. Washington had lied from the start, and now those lies could be used as leverage. Programs like Operation Mongoose, Operation Tilt, and Operation Northwoods, all of them were skeletons in the government's closet. If Marcello and his circle were threatened, they could expose it all. Marcello pulled Garrison into his orbit. He fed him information. He gave him informants. Garrison, armed with inside knowledge, went on the attack. Overnight, he became a sensation, splashed across front pages, dominating television. Yet through it all, Marcello remained off-limits. Behind the scenes, Marcello was playing his own game. He had informants like Irving Davidson whispering back from Washington, warning him about a coming Life magazine expose on the Mafia, about plans to frame him if the Warren report fell apart. The intelligence agencies and the press were drowning in secrets, desperate to keep them buried. Marcello knew it, and he was ready to use it. If they came for him, he'd drag them down with him. The FBI watched closely. After the assassination, Marcello punched an agent and was arrested in New York alongside Carlo Gambino, the Genovese, Colombo and Lucchese bosses, and Tampa's Santo Trafficante. His plausible deniability was evaporating. The sight of him with that cast of characters made it clear. Marcello was no small-time regional boss. He was part of something much larger. But even then, the government's reach over Marcello was limited. Many assumed he had skipped the 1957 Appalachian Summit because he was too powerful to bother. The truth was less dramatic. He wasn't allowed to leave Louisiana. After the Kefauver hearings and a change in immigration law in 1952, Marcello's status was precarious. He was required to report regularly to immigration and naturalization. One wrong move, and he could be deported. Until the day he was forcibly sent to Guatemala, Marcello never left Louisiana. It was his fortress, and he believed himself untouchable there. That illusion began to fade on September 22, 1966, when Carlos Marcello was arrested. Less than a year later, on September 1, 1967, Life magazine, tied to the very same Operation Tilt, came after him in print. The war for the narrative had begun, and Marcello knew it. He wasn't just fighting to save himself. He was fighting to control the story. And maybe, in the process, to turn the tables on the very government that had once been his partner. Frank Sheeran was in the room where things happened. He ran messages, moved money, and kept his mouth shut. He was close enough to Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa to see a truth that never made the papers. The same men bleeding the Union were working the levers to spring Hoffa. Loyalty, power, greed. Same crew, different masks. In school, Sheeran said, Jimmy talked about Ed Parton. The play was simple. Mob lawyer Frank Regano would get an affidavit from Parton claiming the government framed Hoffa. A New Orleans DA had Parton in a vice. Ease the heat, get the paper. That DA also arrested Walter Sheridan for bribery, ammo to smear Sheridan in the press and help Jimmy. All of this came through Carlos Marcello, Russell's and Jimmy's friend in New Orleans, a man who could lean on a DA and make it count. The DA was the same one known for hauling in suspects linked to the Kennedy case. Sometimes a cooperative prosecutor plays a longer game, arrests to smoke out bigger targets. Sheeran wasn't in those talks. He just watched results. A year after Hoffa went away, Bobby Kennedy announced for president. Hoffa didn't care. He was already backing Nixon. Bobby wasn't Attorney General anymore. That was all that mattered to Jimmy. He wanted releases, paper signed, doors opened, and cash moving to where it did the most good. Everyone preferred Lyndon Johnson's AG, Ramsey Clark. No wiretaps, no crusade, nothing like Bobby. When Bobby was killed months later, Jimmy stayed fixed on one thing: getting out. He tracked every update that could shave a day off his sentence and ignored the rest. Prison ate him alive. His hatred of the cell was bigger than any hatred of a Kennedy. He started to believe Frank Fitzsimmons was selling him out. He never showed it. He needed Fitz's help to get the gate open. Pressure followed the money. About $500,000, according to Sheeran, into the right hands, the new Attorney General and the President. Bufalino helped raise it. So did the Chicago outfit and Carlos Marcello. In May, Sheeran got a call from John Francis. "I got a present all wrapped up." John was driving for Russell by then. Reliable, Irish, red-headed. Sheeran's driver on Russell's errands. He knew the Westies from Hell's Kitchen and had old IRA ties. He picked up extra cash and drugs when he had to, but never where Russell could see it. The New York connection wasn't a mystery. Russell kept a 3-bedroom suite at the Consulate Hotel for 25 years, worked the city for jewelry, garments, trucking, union business, restaurants. He had money in Vesuvius, ate there, met there. At the Branding Iron restaurant, John handed Sheeran a heavy black suitcase. Maybe Alan Dorfman's Teamster money, maybe Vegas skim. Either way, it weighed like a problem. Sheeran's Lincoln had a big auxiliary tank, so he wouldn't have to stop where cops liked to shop. He drove straight to the Washington Hilton, carried the case in, and met John Mitchell. They kept it light. No one said what was in the bag. No one had to. Mitchell radiated confidence. The message was received. The politics never stopped. Audie Murphy died in a plane crash, and with him went a Hoffa hope: public support against Ed Partin. 2 weeks later, June 21st, 1971, Fitzsimmons opened the Teamsters' quarterly board meeting in Miami. No reporters, but he let the photographers in. He told the board Hoffa had resigned as president and made Fitz acting president until the convention. Then, President Richard Nixon walked in and sat next to Fitz. Cameras went nuts. 2 days after, June 23, 1971, Jimmy's lawyer, James P. Hoffa, sent a letter to the board. Resignation from key posts, a package meant for the parole board, proof Jimmy planned to retire on his pension and lecture. Preliminary hearing, July 7th. Full rehearing set for August 20th. At the July 71 Miami Beach Convention, Sheeran noticed something off. Inside the hall there was no Hoffa, no photos, no banners, like he'd been erased. Outside, different story. Sheeran and others put Jimmy back on the walls inside. No fireworks without Jimmy's say-so. Joe Hoffa spoke for him. Wishes, respect, and the crowd roared. Fitz wasn't booed. Sheeran also spotted FBI men dressed as maintenance. He turned them around at the door. He'd spent years thinking Hoffa automatically stayed president after the 1967 hit. Now he saw the angles for what they were. On the eve of the rehearing, Fitz praised Nixon's economic plan at a press conference, while other Labour leaders tore it up. At the board, the talk was parole strategy. The hearing tanked. The board didn't like the resignation package or the pension settlement. They dug into Jimmy's organised crime ties and voted no. He could try again in June 1972, right when the Watergate clock would start ticking. People whispered that Fitz engineered the resignation to block Hoffa from running from a cell, played on Hoffa's desperation to go home, then kicked the ladder away. Fitz then went public at a Labor Day rally in Detroit. Nixon should pardon Hoffa. On December 16, 1971, lawyer Morris Schenker bypassed the usual lanes, walked the request into the White House, and got John Mitchell's approval. Right before Christmas, Sheeran visited Lewisburg. Schenker had pardon papers Nixon was expected to sign. Guards looked the other way while the papers slid across. Sheeran read them. Early release with good time in November 1971. No mention of any ban on Jimmy's right to run. Hoffa was already sketching a 1976 comeback. The room felt lighter. The weight dropped later. The executive grant of clemency Nixon, signed December 23, 1971, cut the sentence and freed Hoffa, then slammed a clause on him. No labor management activity until March 1980. The 1976 run was dead. Jimmy spent Christmas with family in St. Louis, then registered with federal parole in Detroit and planned 3 months in Florida. On January 5, 1972, he flew into Miami Beach and got his welcome, though the bigger names kept out of the photos, parole optics. In February, he endorsed Nixon's re-election to avoid poking the bear while on paper. Fitz and the executive board endorsed Nixon too. Hoffa planned to challenge the conditional constitutional fight. His civil rights lawyers said the president can grant or deny clemency, not invent a conditional leash that amounts to a new sentence. A speech ban on union activity until 1980 was a punishment the court never imposed overreach and a First Amendment problem. Jimmy sat tight. Challenge now, and Nixon's parole officers would live in his pockets. He waited until his parole expired in March 1973. Fitz exhaled. Then came the knife fight over who jammed the clause into the paperwork. White House counsel John Dean said he added it at the last minute. Good legal advice. Because Hoffa had verbally promised to stay out until 1980. Charles Colson's name surfaced too, the enemies list man. Dean said Colson sicked the IRS on Harold Gibbons, a Teamster board member who hadn't backed Nixon. Hoffa, under oath, blamed Colson for the clause. Colson kept it short during Watergate hearings, admitted he discussed the pardon with Fitz, then left the White House and landed a fat Teamsters legal contract that used to belong to Edward Bennett Williams. Later, Colson found religion and built a prison ministry. Hoffa's vow was simple: never go back behind a door that locks from the outside. His book laid out why. Prison strips you, page by page, until there's nothing left to bargain with but time. He wouldn't live that way again. Time magazine, June 14, 1979, captured the climate. Teamster leaders had waited to see if Hoffa would try to run again while still serving 13 years for jury tampering and pension fund fraud. The word, he wouldn't. His son James, a union lawyer, made the announcement at Teamster headquarters. The board cheered and lined up behind Fitzsimmons, who would coast at the July 5th Miami Beach convention. A Washington Post piece said the union might pay Hoffa $100,000 a year for life if he stayed out. Denials followed. The paper also said Joe Hoffa would keep a $40,000 job with Teamster women. Young Jimmy would be general counsel at $50,000. Lawyers told Hoffa parole odds were better if he surrendered the presidency. Petitions with 250,000 signatures showed up at the White House. William Loeb of the Manchester Union leader, $2 million borrower from the Teamster Pension Fund, campaigned hard for Hoffa. His paper floated a story that Ed Partin had recanted. Justice and Partin didn't confirm. Loeb met John Mitchell the day before Hoffa's decision. Bad coincidence for anyone claiming there was no arrangement. The parole board, stacked with Nixon appointees, said no review until spring, but could reopen within 90 days. It meant Hoffa could walk earlier than anyone said out loud. Fitz became the amiable public face, opposite of Hoffa's iron, while the union spread faster than rivals, branching into offices and airlines. Even locked up, Hoffa still carried titles in Michigan and Detroit. No law barred him from taking those seats when he walked. June 28, 1971. The streets wrote their own memo. It signaled that the old ways were slipping and a new kind of cleanup was coming, for Hoffa, for Sam Giancana, for Johnny Roselli. Congress finally gave prosecutors a weapon that worked. In 1970, RICO landed, new rules that could pull the bosses into the dock alongside the button men. The country was already raw from the murders of John F. Kennedy in '63 and Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy in '68. Suspicions ran south toward mob country. Fixes died in committee. Bobby Kennedy never got the chance to reopen Dallas. When Hoffa walked in '71, Watergate was warming. Trust was ice-thin. CIA and FB. Leaks confirmed earlier marriages of convenience with the mob against Castro, proof the underworld and the government had shaken hands when it suited both. A new witness in the Kennedy case lined up clean with the autopsy on Officer J.D. Tippit. Shot locations, sequence, motive. He said Oswald fired, watched Tippit fall, doubled back and finished him instead of running, closing the threat. That testimony helped spark the House Select Committee on Assassinations. The old files got new air. By 1972, the mob had stopped holding Jimmy up. He turned and faced what he used to ride, corruption in the unions and the men behind it. He started talking, on phones that were probably tapped, about how deep the rot ran. Bombs went off. Cars burned. People disappeared. Families got phone calls that never said enough. The FBI hit back too. Raids, seizures, indictments. It was war on two fronts, outside pressure and inside cleanup. The big families hovered over everything, Luciano into Genovese, Anastasia into Gambino, Colombo and Lucchese, all with their flags planted. In the shadows stood Russell Bufalino, rarely photographed, always consulted, a quiet decider whose reach touched presidents and Jimmy Hoffa's calendar. The Chicago outfit held its lane with Hoffa. Mutual interests, guaranteed repayment on loans, no reason to fear him as long as the machine ran on time. But Jimmy's plan to take the Teamsters back scared the others. Carlos Marcello, Bufalino, Tony Provenzano, Santo Trafficante. They didn't just fear a power shift, they feared a microphone. If Hoffa got hauled into a hearing and asked about Dallas, he wouldn't play monk. Tony Pro told Marcello Hoffa was talking too loose about the Kennedy murder. There were whispers about Jack Ruby's contacts before he shot Oswald, threads tied to the mob and Teamsters pipelines. The risk wasn't a headline. It was a subpoena. By then, consensus didn't need a meeting. If they could make you, they could unmake you. And if keeping the peace meant silencing Jimmy Hoffa, the men who once carried his bags were ready to carry his coffin. Audie Murphy went down in a small plane on May 28, 1971, circling a tract tied to the Hoffa crowd. The crash killed more than a war hero. It killed a play. Murphy had the juice to lean on Ed Partin's problem and steady Jimmy's appeal. With Murphy gone, that avenue closed like a steel door. 6 days later, after Frank Mitchell told Frank Sheeran that nothing comes cheap, the Union staged a bit of theatre. Frank Fitzsimmons and young James P. Hoffa booked the Playboy Plaza in Miami Beach and faced the microphones. Fitz read a letter from Jimmy. He wouldn't seek re-election. He backed his old local 299 pal, Fitz, for president. It sounded like succession. It read like surrender. It was neither. It was leverage, thrown on the table for the parole board and for the White House. On June 21st, the executive board met in Miami. No reporters in the room. Photographers allowed, which tells you what they wanted. Pictures, not questions. Fitz stunned the board. Jimmy Hoffa had resigned as president and named him acting president until the convention. Then Richard M. Nixon walked in, sat down beside Fitz, and gave the cameras a tableau. The message was simple. The presidency of the United States recognized Frank Fitzsimmons as the man at the top of the Teamsters. That image would do work in a parole file no memo could match. 2 days later, June 23rd, James P. Hoffa delivered a follow-up letter to the board. His father, he wrote, had resigned from multiple posts across the Teamsters and related outfits. Jimmy would retire on his pension, teach, give talks. The letter was for the board, but the real audience sat in Washington. It brought a preliminary parole hearing on July 7th and a full rehearing set for August 20th. New evidence of retirement, a soft landing scripted on legal paper. At the July convention in Miami Beach, the mood split down the middle. Outside, a giant portrait of Jimmy dominated the facade like old times. Inside, his face was gone. No banners, no photo wall. It was an erasure, Soviet style, done in daylight. Frank Sheeran clocked it the minute he walked in. He and a couple of others pulled Jimmy's portrait off the exterior and hung it inside, next to Fitz's. They didn't swap positions. Not yet. No open war without Jimmy's say-so. Jo Hoffa took the microphone and delivered the message herself. Jimmy sent his love and his fight. The hall came to its feet. They didn't boo Fitz. They just told him where the loyalty still sat. That same week, Sheeran spotted FBI men trying to pass as maintenance. He turned them at the door. They didn't come back with a supervisor. That told him what he needed to know. Up to then, Sheeran had carried a bad assumption, that Jimmy had ceded the presidency to Fitz when he went away in 1967. He only now understood the truth. Jimmy had still been president when he hit Lewisburg. Fitz was vice president and acting, but he wore the office like it was tailored for him, and everyone treated him accordingly. It explained a lot, like why Fitz once sent Frank to Spring Garden Street for a gunfight, as if assignments flowed from him alone. On August 19th, the night before the rehearing, Fitz praised Nixon's economic program at a press conference. Labour's house organ clapping for the White House, while George Meany and most of organised Labour fought wage price controls tooth and nail. The next morning, August 20th, the parole board did its work with cold hands. James P. detailed Jimmy's resignations and the scholarly life ahead. The panel yawned. They asked if James P.'s own position in the union proved anything about his father's fitness to reintegrate. They asked about Jo Hoffa's work with Drive. Then they went where they always meant to go, the mob ties. In the middle of it all sat another sore point. Jimmy had converted his pension into a lump sum, about $1.7 million. To an accountant, that was a clean number. To the board, it looked like a man cashing out his leverage. To enemies like Tony Provenzano, who had begged for help with his own pension, it looked like a thumb in the eye. The board voted unanimously to deny parole. Try again next June, they said. The same month burglars would break into a DC office and set off a different kind of avalanche. The whispers started immediately. Did Fitz play Jimmy into resigning? Take the titles off him so he couldn't run from a cell? Did he dangle an August homecoming that never existed? Maybe. Maybe Jimmy let himself believe it because he wanted out, and once out, he thought he could walk the titles back by 1976 or earlier if Fitz stumbled. Either way, the White House's parole board wasn't biting. Then came a quiet move with loud consequences. On December 16, 1971, Morris Schenker walked a pardon petition straight into the White House, skipping the usual channels. Attorney General John Mitchell signed off with speed you don't see in government unless somebody wants it done. A week later, December 23rd, President Nixon issued an executive grant of clemency. It cut the sentence and freed Jimmy with his good time. Then came the hook, the condition: Jimmy R. Hoffa would not, directly or indirectly, manage any labor organization until March 1980. Violated, and the commutation was void. The ink made the trap official. Sheeran had looked at paperwork in Lewisburg before Christmas. Nothing then mentioned a ban. In the lunchroom, they were already talking about a 1976 comeback. That joy lasted until Detroit, when the final instrument showed the clause that mattered. If Jimmy had maxed out his term, he'd have walked right into the convention season. Instead, he went home for Christmas in St. Louis, checked in with federal parole in Detroit, and booked 3 months in Florida. On January 5th, 1972, he landed in Miami Beach to handshakes you give a man you can't be photographed with. He endorsed Nixon's re-election in February. Practical parole politics, not love. In July, the executive board endorsed Nixon too. One dissent. Harold Gibbons, who had once run a half-star flag for JFK and never heard the end of it from Jimmy. Behind the scenes, Jimmy lined up a constitutional challenge to the condition. His lawyers argued what he liked to hear. A president can grant or deny, not invent a new punishment. A speech and association ban to 1980 went beyond any sentence and trampled the First Amendment. Jimmy waited. Pick that fight under parole, and you invite supervision that never sleeps. He'd filed after March 1973. The fight over who salted the clause into the documents turned into its own trench war. White House counsel John Dean said he wrote it in at the last minute. Good lawyering, he said, because Jimmy had agreed to stay out. Charles Colson's name surfaced. Dean said Colson weaponized the IRS against Harold Gibbons for refusing to salute Nixon. Jimmy, under oath, blamed Colson for the condition. Colson gave Watergate testimony with the volume turned down, admitted he talked pardon mechanics with Fitz, then left government for a Teamsters legal retainer that used to belong to Edward Bennett Williams. Later, Colson would find the church and build a prison ministry, biography pivoting where the money used to be. All the while, Jimmy kept his calculations tight. He knew the rules of parole. Keep your head down, don't spark, don't give them a reason to haul you back. He'd talk about reform, not control. He'd write, push for better conditions behind the walls he hated, and wait for the leash to come off in March 73. Then he'd make his move. Back at the start of this run, another set of moves had been in play, moves that showed how politics and muscle really met. Regano was supposed to get an affidavit from Ed Partin saying the government framed Jimmy. A New Orleans DA had Partin in a box, ease the pressure, get the paper. The same DA popped Walter Sheridan on a bribery charge to rough up Sheridan's name in the press. Carlos Marcello had the weight to influence that office. He used it. Sheeran watched, didn't ask questions, moved what he was told to move. He remembered the day John Francis, Russell's reliable redhead, handed him a heavy black suitcase at the branding iron. Could have been Alan Dorfman's pipeline, could have been Vegas skim. It was money that travelled like sensitive cargo. Sheeran had rigged his Lincoln with an extra fuel tank to avoid trooper territory and casual stops. He drove it to the Washington Hilton and delivered it to John Mitchell in a conversation that said everything without saying anything. Mitchell's calm told Sheeran the risk was already priced in. For Jimmy, the true betrayal wasn't legal. It was photographic. June 21st, Nixon sitting shoulder to shoulder with Fitz in front of the union's executive board. That picture told every board member and every lieutenant where power was supposed to flow while Jimmy did time. The parole board saw it too. So did judges, agents, editors. That's how you move a country without moving a muscle. The board's no in August felt final. The Christmas commutation felt like a win. The condition read like a life sentence in plain clothes. The old Jimmy would have blown up the bridge right then. The new Jimmy, older, meaner, counting days, decided to wait. He'd outlast the leash, he told himself, and then he'd come back for the chair in 1976. He'd tell people what Fitz had sold, what loans had gone rotten, who collected on the skim and who signed off. He'd remind the delegates whose names still filled a hall. But I ended the way these stories do, with the math cold and correct. The White House got what it wanted Jimmy out, but disarmed. Fitz got the office and the photo op. The mob got time to settle accounts and reposition. The parole board got to say, It had considered all factors. Sheeran got his man out the gate, but felt the floor tilt under his feet. And Jimmy Hoffa, cash in hand, family at Christmas, a winter in Florida, Nixon's re-election stickers on Union letterhead, read the clause again and understood the deal. He was free to breathe. He was not free to be Jimmy Hoffa. The world Jimmy Hoffa walked back into in 1972 was not the one he had left in '67. The mob had stopped hiding. Violence that once unfolded in alleys and basements was now happening in daylight, under cameras, in front of witnesses. The old omertà still existed, but now it was enforced with bullets instead of whispers. And behind the chaos, the same invisible hands were stitching together organized crime, politics, and covert war into one seamless machine. The first shock came on June 28, 1971. Joe Colombo, boss of the Colombo family and self-styled defender of Italian-American civil rights, stood on a stage at a Columbus Circle rally when a black man stepped forward and put a bullet in his head. Colombo hit the ground but didn't die right away. As he bled, the shooter was cut down instantly, shot dead by someone in the crowd whose job was to make sure no questions could ever be asked. It was an old Louisiana trick they called the Patsy method. Use a desperate man to do the dirty work, then erase him before he can talk. It was more than an assassination. It was a message. Nobody was untouchable anymore, not even a boss at a public rally. And if Colombo could be hit like that, anyone could. That included Jimmy Hoffa. By 1972, blood was becoming the mob's punctuation mark. It wasn't just mobsters dying. Politicians and civil rights leaders were being picked off too. John Kennedy in '63, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy in '68. The country was losing its faith in everything: the government, the press, the law. CIA leaks showed the agency had partnered with the mob in the early '60s to kill Castro. The Mafia, in turn, had been moving arms and money for US covert operations. The lines between Washington and the underworld weren't blurred anymore. They were erased. And then came Joey Gallo. Crazy Joe was everything the old bosses hated: flashy, ambitious, and reckless. He liked the spotlight and talked too much. After getting out of prison, Gallo had aligned himself with black and Puerto Rican gangs, trying to muscle into drug territory the families considered theirs. He taunted Joe Colombo's people, hinting he'd had a hand in the hit. Even the newspapers started treating Gallo like some outlaw folk hero. Frank Sheeran got the call. Frank wasn't a button man in the traditional sense. He was Russell Bufalino's problem solver, half enforcer, half diplomat. A 6'4" Irishman who had killed for the army in Italy, he was one of the few outsiders the old dons trusted. Sheeran had spent years running errands between Hoffa and Bufalino, delivering cash, messages, and threats. If he was told to do something, he did it. Clean, quiet, and without questions. On April 7th, 1972, Gallo walked into Umberto's clam house in Little Italy for his 43rd birthday dinner. It was late. He was half drunk and laughing with his family. Inside, someone was waiting. Witnesses heard 6 shots, maybe more. Gallo staggered into the street, blood blooming across his shirt, and died on the pavement. No one was ever charged. But in the years that followed, whispers hardened into a name: Frank Sheeran. Sheeran never bragged, but decades later he told Charles Brandt he painted houses that night, mob slang for a killing. He described where he stood, how he walked in, how he fired. Eyewitnesses from that night, who had no reason to lie, said a tall man with reddish hair and a limp approached Gallo from behind and shot him point blank. They all described Frank Sheeran without ever knowing his name. The hit on Gallo was more than revenge. It was a reset. The bosses were done tolerating men who couldn't follow orders or stay quiet. Gallo's murder set a precedent that would echo through the next few years, as people with too much knowledge or too much ego were erased one by one. Even the CIA's old allies weren't safe. Sam Giancana, who had helped the agency plot Castro's assassination, was shot in the back of the head while cooking sausage in his Oak Park home in 1975. Johnny Roselli, another mob liaison to the CIA, was found stuffed into a 55-gallon oil drum floating in Biscayne Bay. Both had been subpoenaed by the Senate to testify about the CIA Mafia plots. Neither made it to the witness stand. For Frank Sheeran, this wasn't theory. It was business. He moved money, ran errands, and kept his ear to the ground. Russell Bufalino trusted him enough to use him as a go-between for sensitive conversations, especially with Hoffa. Russell was a different kind of boss. He avoided flash, hated press, and preferred deals done over coffee and cigarettes in a diner booth. But his reach was long, and his word carried weight from New York to Florida. By 1973, Hoffa's patience had worn out. The Nixon leash was set to snap in March, and he was already talking like a man who planned to take his union back. But the world he wanted no longer existed. Frank Fitzsimmons had reshaped the Teamsters into something more corporate and less combative. The mob had burrowed deeper into the pension fund, and casino money from Las Vegas skim operations was flowing into pockets Hoffa no longer controlled. Hoffa hated it. He started talking openly about cleaning house, rooting out the gangsters who had hijacked the union. He mocked the bosses in conversations he knew were probably tapped. He spoke about the Kennedy assassination in ways that made people nervous. He hinted he had information that could blow the doors off the official story, and he said it loud enough for people like Tony Provenzano and Carlos Marcello to hear. Marcello was already on edge. He'd built an empire out of New Orleans and had enough political muscle to influence district attorneys and senators. The last thing he needed was Hoffa shooting his mouth off about Dallas and dragging old ghosts back into the light. Provenzano, still seething from Hoffa's cold dismissal of his pension plea, fed Marcello updates about Hoffa's loose talk. Provenzano told him Hoffa wasn't just angry, he was reckless. The problem was bigger than gossip. If Hoffa got subpoenaed and decided to talk, he could connect dots that were never meant to be connected. Teamsters' money, mob operations, Jack Ruby's movements before he shot Oswald. Ruby had ties to both the Mafia and the Teamsters. He had taken calls from known mob associates days before Dallas. If Hoffa confirmed any of that under oath, it could drag the underworld into one of the darkest chapters in American history. And Hoffa was planning a return to power that terrified them even more. He wasn't content with a cameo. He wanted the presidency back. He had the loyalty of the rank and file, the charisma, and the name. Even sidelined, he was still the most famous labor leader in America, and he was ready to fight his way back. But the mob didn't want to fight. They wanted control. Fitzsimmons was easy, amiable, pliable, not inclined to question how pension money was moved or where it ended up. Hoffa was the opposite. He was stubborn, prideful, and increasingly unpredictable. The bosses could work with Fitz. They couldn't risk Hoffa. Meanwhile, Washington was digging deeper. The House Select Committee on Assassinations launched in 1976, but the groundwork started earlier. A new witness emerged in the Tippit killing, describing in chilling detail how Oswald doubled back to shoot the wounded officer again, execution style. The account matched the autopsy perfectly and reignited doubts about the official story. Combined with leaks about CIA Mafia operations, the committee's work threatened to rip open old wounds and possibly expose new ones. By 1974, Hoffa's crusade had taken on the air of inevitability. He told friends he would run again. He promised to expose the corruption poisoning the Union. He framed it as a fight for the working man. But everyone knew it was also about revenge, against Fitz, against the mob, against the politicians who had boxed him in. The bosses heard every word. To them, Hoffa wasn't just a problem. He was a liability. He knew too much, talked too much, and refused to stay in the box they'd built for him. And as the bodies of old allies like Giancana and Roselli piled up, one truth became impossible to ignore. The men who once protected Jimmy Hoffa were now discussing how to stop him. The code had always been clear. If they could make you, they could unmake you. The blood in Little Italy and Oak Park and Biscayne Bay was proof. And somewhere in that calculus, a decision was forming, one that would end with Jimmy Hoffa stepping into a car on a hot July afternoon in 1975 and never stepping out again. But that reckoning still waited in the wings. For now, the house was being repainted, shot by shot, deal by deal, betrayal by betrayal. The bodies were warnings, the silence was enforced, and Jimmy Hoffa, defiant and fearless, kept talking. They tried to keep the business quiet. By 75, it was all on the record: names, dates, memos, subpoenas. The old ways, hush, a nod, a phone call, were getting dragged into fluorescent courtrooms and typed up on government letterhead. The street was still the street, but the paper trail had teeth. Russell DeSico learned that the hard way. 45, a buffalo squirrel who'd seen too much, he gave the grand jury what it needed on the Hasselbeck murder and then went missing. The feds found him in Miami and hauled him back on a material witness warrant. Judge John T. Curtin parked him in the Erie County lockup on $150,000 bail. DeSico had told prosecutors he didn't want to face a jury. He didn't get a vote. His absence had already blown up the Tascarella trial. First-degree murder on the killing of Stephen Hasselbeck, shot in his Maryland Street apartment the day before he was due to testify in a counterfeiting case. Tascarella also wore a perjury indictment for lying to a federal grand jury about the obstruction around that murder. DeSico had been indicted once, wriggled free on immunity, and even skated with a suspended sentence after pleading to a $14 million art theft out of Bradford back in '68. Now he was a government asset, whether he liked it or not. Joe Zito was the other kind of witness: loud, useful, dirty. He took the stand in U.S. District Court and introduced himself plain: loan shark enforcer, 20 years a professional criminal, connected to the Russell Bufalino crew out of New York by way of Pennsylvania. Frank Sindone, a Philly earner, brought him 15 to 20 Shylocks in '68 and told him to lean. Zito defined lean for the jury: make them pay up. He was serving 12 on an old extortion beef and living on a government stipend while he talked. The defense painted him as a paid liar looking for a discount. Zito didn't blink. He'd done hijacks, burglaries, robberies, collections. Now he was doing testimony. Behind it, the wall was cracking. Since Appalachian, 57, Russell Bufalino's name had kept slipping into the papers, first as a rumor, then as a fact. Valachi made it worse in the '60s. He gave Congress the family tree. Hoover had denied there was a mafia, while other agencies, off the books, leaned on it when they needed muscle or access. In the war years, syndicate names: Luciano, Costello, Lansky, Dalitz, Anastasia, worked the OSS end of the dock and the waterfront. After 45, as the Cold War hardened, the traffic changed lanes. Weapons embargoes meant nothing if you had control of ports and trucking. In Detroit and up through Canada, Jewish and Italian earners moved guns to the newborn state of Israel, while Teamster freight rolled on schedule. Then came the '60s and the CIA's games with Cuba, and the habit of treating Cosa Nostra like a contractor you didn't put on the org chart. By spring '75, the press had receipts. One FBI memo said Bobby Kennedy knew as early as '61 that CIA had put the outfit on Castro problems. The Warren Commission hadn't been told. McCloy and Coleman confirmed it. They never saw the plots. Hoover's paper trail suggested otherwise. The line from Langley was that it never occurred to anyone Castro would hit back by killing a president. The line from Common Sense said, "You keep that out of the record, because it's dynamite if it leaks." Then the Sacramento Bee dropped a live one. A former CIA hand told reporter Denny Walsh that 4 underworld figures, ex-Havana casino bosses who'd buried $750,000 in oilcloth before running from Castro, fed the agency intelligence ahead of the Bay of Pigs, troop positions, naval assets. Most importantly, a promise the people would rise when the shooting started. In exchange, the mob got a handshake promise. Recover the buried cash if the invasion worked, reopen the casinos when the flag changed. Names surfaced: Russell Bufalino out of Pennsylvania, Jimmy Plumeri and Sally Burns Granello from the Lucchese side, George Levine out of Florida. The Bee said their boat even sat off Cuba with a CIA man aboard, waiting to help jam Havana traffic. When the beachhead crumbled, they turned around and went home. Bufalino fired back the same day. A lie, he told the Scranton Times. He didn't know the other men. He floated a libel suit. Maybe he meant it. Maybe it was for show. Either way, the denial made the same headlines as the accusation and kept his name in print. Rockefeller's Blue Ribbon panel tried to put a lid on it. On June 3rd, the vice president told reporters the CIA had strayed past the law, but hadn't run a domestic spy shop at scale. "No one should be dumbfounded, we, he said. Dillon and Reagan backed him. The report was on the president's desk by the weekend. The message was tidy. Yes, some misconduct. No, nothing that shakes the republic. It read like a tourniquet, tight enough to stop the bleeding, not enough to cut circulation. None of them stopped the cases in Buffalo. Judge Curtin, who'd overseen the 1974 vending machine assault trial where Bufalino and others walked, was asked by the Justice Department strike force to step aside from the new extortion case. They said his charge to the jury last time, especially about the credibility of informant Joe Zito, had hurt the government. Curtin shrugged, recused, and made way for a visiting judge from Manhattan, Charles L. Bryant. Jury selection set. Trial on deck. Opening day, the government framed it clean. Russell Bufalino, 70 plus, and still the quiet head of the northeastern Pennsylvania family. Anthony Guy Guarnieri, Endicott Lieutenant. Vincent Jimmy Cassie, Buffalo Muscle. The charge, a 1968 conspiracy to shake $100,000, and later, by testimony, $190,000, out of Geneva jeweler Emmanuel Caratozzolo of Jerry's Discount. Prosecutor Robert Ozer said orders flowed from Bufalino to Guarnieri to Zito, with Cacci assigned to help collect. The defense conceded that an attempt had been made by someone, but hung it all on Zito's word. "He's selling a bill of goods," Bufalino's lawyer Harold Borianas told the jury. "If he wants a sentence cut, he has to give them Russell." Zito took the stand and did damage. He put names in rooms and cars on roads, Batavia to New York City to Geneva, 5 or 6 trips, not 4 like he'd told the grand jury. He owned the inconsistency and called it confusion then, clarity now. When Borianas tried to unspool the whole of Zito's rap sheet, Judge Bryant clipped him with the new evidence rules: stick to the last decade. Everyone in the room already knew what Zito was. The point was whether the story held. The atmosphere turned poisonous around the edges. Ozer told the court, outside the jury's hearing, that Lisa Locasto in Florida, a former girlfriend of Brooklyn player Sebastian Buster Alloy, got an anonymous call. "Be careful when your child swims. It's easy to get over that wall." No mention of the case, no direct threat, just enough to chill bone. Another witness left the courthouse and picked up a black Lincoln in the mirror, 4 men riding him to the curb. Borianas exploded, saying for all anyone knew the FBI made those calls to juice the headlines. The judge kept it away from the panel. He was shocked, he said. He also knew what prejudice looked like. Catty's luck broke first. Under Cross, a government informant, Ralph Habestro, wandered into an old robbery, Mancuso's restaurant in Batavia, April '68, and blurted that Catty helped plan it. Instant prejudice. Judge Bryant severed Catty out and declared a mistrial for him alone. The case against Bufalino and Guarnieri rolled on. Bryant denied the dismissal motion. If believed, he told counsel, Zito's testimony is enough. Away from Buffalo, the Scranton grand jury kept chewing. The panel heard from state property officials and local contractors about leases, flood aid, after Agnes, tax returns, school district business. Louis de Naples brought records. Angelo Ferrara carried a bag of paperwork and said there was nothing wrong. Capi Giamento, Bufalino's driver, made an appearance. Indictments came down across the board: tax evasion, forged checks, cigarette smuggling. And somewhere inside that panel, Russell's name surfaced again. No one would say why. They never do at that stage. Back in Buffalo, the parade of government and defense skirmishes turned into a pattern. Zito said Russell and Guarnieri gave the order. The defense said Zito wanted out of prison and was inventing a ladder to climb down. The judge kept the rails tight. The jury kept notes. Caratozzolo called Zito an ambassador of goodwill on the first approach and admitted he was scared. You didn't need a doctorate to read his fear. Every day in court was a reminder of how much had moved from whispers to microphones. The B's stories kept getting quoted. The FBI memo about Bobby's knowledge sat with the Rockefellers and the Senate, hot to the touch. The CIA's retired counsel, Lawrence Houston, didn't recollect the mob casino intelligence, but he wouldn't deny it either. Not implausible, he told the reporter. That was Washington talk for. We've done worse. Bufalino, surgically private for decades, was now a headline generator against his will. One column said the CIA had recruited him for Cuba. The next, he ran his denial. Then, a docket item listed him as the boss of a family that specialized in narcotics and labor rackets. Then, a judge from Manhattan took his case because the last judge had gotten too close. In a business that lived on shadows, this was floodlight. The witness bench showed how the ecosystem worked when pressure hit. Some cooperated for stipends and reduced time. Some vanished until the feds dragged them back by the collar. Some got calls about backyard pools. Some claimed illness to avoid travel. Somebody followed somebody in a black Lincoln. It was the same old chessboard with new rules. Phones tapped, grand juries stacked, judges swapping out midstream, reporters phoning Langley for comment. None of this existed in a vacuum. The Teamsters' war was heating again. Hoffa was staging a comeback in speeches and backrooms, and every new story that tied mob money to CIA experiments or Teamster loans to Vegas cash made his return more dangerous for everyone involved. If the House Assassinations Committee hauled in the wrong man at the wrong time, the threads could run from Havana to Dallas to Detroit in one sitting. Men like Russell read the headlines and counted votes and liabilities. By late July, the government rested in Buffalo with Zito's story standing. The judge told the panel it was enough if they believed him. The defense signaled it would put on inconsistencies, grudges, self-preservation, anything to break the spine of a single witness case. Outside the courthouse, grand juries kept meeting. Inside Washington, commissions kept writing. In the street, phones kept ringing. The old code said you solve problems quietly. 75 made that harder. The boxes were labeled. The transcripts were archived. People who used to vanish now got booked, arraigned, and quoted. The men who once moved nations with a whisper now had to hold their tongue while a clerk swore them in. And from the foot of that staircase, De Sico in custody, Zito on the stand, Bufalino in the dock, Langley denying, newspapers printing. Jimmy Hoffa was pawing the ground. He wanted the big chair back. He said he'd clean house. He said he'd talk if he had to. The people who listened decided they couldn't let him. In the summer of 1975, a federal courtroom in Buffalo became the stage for the latest act in Russell Bufalino's long duel with the government. At 71, the quiet boss from Exeter, Pennsylvania, the man whose name had been whispered in connection with everything from the Appalachian fiasco to the killing of Albert Anastasia, once again found himself in the crosshairs. The charge this time, a $100,000 extortion plot dating back to 1968, targeting a Geneva, New York, businessman named Emanuele Caratozzolo. The government's case leaned hard on one man, Joseph Zito. A convicted extortionist already serving 12 years, Zito had flipped, trading his loyalty to the life for a chance to redeem himself in the eyes of the law. He told the jury that he'd worked for Bufalino and Anthony Guarnieri, Bufalino's alleged lieutenant out of Endicott, and that they'd hired him to squeeze $100,000 out of Caratozzolo. He claimed there had been phone calls, meetings, even plans hatched in a suite at the Consulate Hotel in Manhattan. Caratozzolo, the supposed victim, didn't back him up. Taking the stand, he denied ever speaking to Zito on the phone, denied calling the police, denied even trusting them. "I never called the police," he said flatly. "I never trusted them." It was the first crack in the prosecution's story. Things didn't get better from there. A mistrial was declared for co-defendant Vincent Cacci after a witness dragged his name into another crime mid-testimony. Cacci would face his own trial later, leaving Bufalino and Guarnieri to fight this one alone. The defense strategy was simple: burn Zito's credibility to the ground. Edgar Nemoya, Guarnieri's attorney, promised to show that his client couldn't have met Zito when the government claimed he had, that he'd been out of the country, or living elsewhere at the time. And witness by witness, the defense began dismantling Zito's story. Harvey Weiss, a hotel employee, testified that records didn't show Zito staying at the Consulate Hotel during the period he claimed. Remo Allio, a lawyer and long-time acquaintance of both defendants, told the court that he and Guarnieri were on a European cruise during the supposed meetings. Augustine Riolo, a dressmaker, confirmed he was on that same cruise, and disputed Zito's descriptions of the hotel suite where the conspiracy was allegedly planned. The prosecution pushed back, hammering at inconsistencies. They called Allio back to the stand and grilled him over loans he'd made to Bufalino and Guarnieri. Loans he had once refused to discuss before a grand jury, citing attorney-client privilege. Allio insisted his relationship with Bufalino was primarily social, and denied handling money for him. He admitted to loaning Guarnieri $10,000 in 1971, which he believed had been repaid, though he couldn't remember when. A $5,000 loan to Bufalino in 1969, used to rebuild a house destroyed by Hurricane Agnes, remained unpaid. Was it a gift? "No," Allio said. "I know I'm going to get my money back." Other witnesses filled in the picture. Frank Inglese testified that electricity usage at Guarnieri's home during the summer of 1968 was far below average, suggesting the house was empty when Zito said meetings took place there. Guarnieri's nephew, Anthony, said he had driven his uncle to New York to board a ship to Italy, spending the days before departure preparing for the trip. Every detail chipped away at Zito's credibility. The prosecution countered with a few rebuttal witnesses of its own, including Carmen Pollard, the daughter of a woman once involved with Brooklyn mobster Sebastian Alloy. She recalled meeting Bufalino once in 1968 at a New York hotel suite. But under cross-examination, She admitted that was the only time she'd ever seen him. After days of testimony, 8 defense witnesses, and hours of summations, the case went to the jury. They deliberated late into the night, even asking to have Caratozzolo's grand jury testimony read back to them. In court, Bufalino nodded off in his chair, while Guarnieri stretched out on a bench. They chatted with family and lawyers as the jury wrestled with the evidence. The defense hammered Zito one last time. Nemoya called him a conman, desperate to make himself valuable to the government. When Zito told one lie, he told the jury, he had to tell another and another. Harold Borianaz, Bufalino's attorney, argued that Zito's only connection to Bufalino was a chance encounter on a 1966 cruise. He's devious, he's calculating, he's a conman, Borianaz said. He needs a target. He's got to find somebody he thinks his big prosecutor Robert Ozer fired back. If there is a conspiracy and the only people present are co-conspirators, he asked, how can we prosecute without testimony from a criminal? He reminded the jury that Zito had invoked the name of Sebastian Alloy in the shakedown, a name with no resonance in Geneva, but heavy meaning in Brooklyn. Where did Zito get Alloy's name? He demanded. On July 24th, after more than 24 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. What is your verdict as far as the defendant Russell A. Bufalino? Asked the clerk. Not guilty, the foreman said. The same for Guarnieri. It was Bufalino's third acquittal since 1971. Outside the courtroom, Bufalino looked pleased, but unsurprised. It turned out the way I anticipated, he said. He blasted Ozer and the Justice Department's Organized Crime Strike Force for what he called trumped-up charges. Asked if he'd finally retired, he smirked. I'd like to retire, he said, but they won't let me. I've got to pay my lawyers Guarnieri less guarded, said he'd retire in January. Both insisted they were in the dressmaking business. Their lawyers were jubilant. 24 citizens have come to the conclusion that the Justice Department refuses to see that Joseph Zito is a liar, Borianaz said. Nemoye agreed. This jury perceived Zito as a liar. Guarnieri had only one word: beautiful. For Bufalino, the acquittal was more than a legal victory. It was proof that even with the federal government bearing down on him, he could still outmaneuver them. But even as he walked free, something far more dangerous was taking shape, something no one in that courtroom could have predicted. 1 week after the verdict, Jimmy Hoffa vanished. Frank Sheeran, Hoffa's trusted enforcer, had reached out to arrange a secret meeting, a summit of mob power that would include Tony Provenzano, Detroit's top men, the calculating Bufalino, and possibly even Fat Tony Salerno. The topic, Hoffa's return to the Teamsters' throne. But Hoffa wasn't just looking to reclaim his union. He was threatening to blow the lid off decades of dirty secrets. He told Sheeran he had documents and information that could destroy the mob and implicate powerful men in government. He hinted that he could tie organized crime to the Bay of Pigs invasion, and maybe even to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. For Bufalino, this wasn't just business. It was survival. He'd spent a lifetime keeping his name out of the headlines, hiding in the shadows while his influence stretched from Pennsylvania to Havana. The Appalachian disaster had dragged him into the light once before. He couldn't afford another spotlight, not one that burned hotter than Hoffa's threats. In Detroit, any hit needed the blessing of Joe Zerilli, the aging don who still controlled the city. Zerilli understood what was at stake. Hoffa's words could expose brothers he'd bled with. He wouldn't let that happen. But he was careful. No one directly tied to Detroit would touch Hoffa. When the day came, every man in the outfit had an airtight alibi. And on July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa went to lunch and never came back. Jimmy Hoffa never did quite well. By 1974, 2 years out of prison and still chained by Nixon's 1980 clause, he was done pretending. He'd waited, played polite, even endorsed the president who boxed him in. Now he was ready to fight for what he thought was his. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the largest union in the free world, and the throne he believed no one else deserved to sit on. The trouble was the world around him had changed, and the people he once trusted were no longer on his side. Frank Fitzsimmons had grown comfortable in the big chair. Under his leadership, the Teamsters had become a quieter, more corporate machine. He wasn't Hoffa, didn't have the fire or the muscle, but that suited the bosses just fine. Fitz didn't ask hard questions about the pension fund or where the Las Vegas skim went. He didn't threaten anyone's rackets, and unlike Hoffa, he didn't dream about taking on the mob. For Jimmy, Fitz's compliance was unforgivable. He called him a puppet in private and a traitor in public. He vowed to take back the presidency at the next convention and clean the gangsters out of the Union, starting with Tony Provenzano, the same man he once called a friend. Frank Sheeran watched the walls close in from a dangerous middle ground. He'd been loyal to Hoffa for years, but his bond with Russell Bufalino ran deeper. Russell had pulled strings to help Hoffa get out, but he was also the quiet hand guiding many of the men now plotting against him. Sheeran understood the old code. If a man became a problem, the solution was permanent. And Hoffa, with his mouth and his memory, was becoming a very big problem. By 1974, Hoffa was talking too much. He raged about corruption inside the Union. He hinted he knew the truth about Dallas, about Jack Ruby's calls, the money trails, and the shadow deals that linked the mob to the Kennedy assassination. He told people he had evidence, records that could blow open the secrets men like Carlos Marcello and Santo Traficante had buried for a decade. And he said it loud enough that word inevitably found its way back to them. Provenzano heard it first. He ran to Marcello, reporting that Hoffa was talking reckless, about the Kennedys, about the pension fund, about people who were supposed to stay invisible. Marcello, who had already spent years under suspicion for the Kennedy hit, understood the stakes. Hoffa wasn't just threatening their business. He was threatening to burn down the firewall that separated the mob from the government's darkest corners. The timing couldn't have been worse. The Watergate scandal had shattered what little faith Americans still had in their government. New revelations were emerging about CIA plots with organized crime to kill Castro. The House Select Committee on Assassinations was gearing up, and fresh testimony about Officer J.D. Tippett's murder was forcing investigators to revisit old evidence. A single subpoena with Hoffa's name on it could light a fuse none of them could control. Russell Bufalino saw it coming before most. He'd spent decades navigating storms like this, always a step ahead, always a ghost in the background. Russell didn't raise his voice or make threats. He just asked questions. One night over dinner, he looked at Hoffa and asked, "What are you running for?" "My union," Hoffa shot back. "It's mine." "I built it," Russell leaned in. "There are people higher than me, Jimmy. Higher than Fitz. Higher than anyone you think you know, and they're starting to think you're showing a lack of appreciation for Dallas." Hoffa brushed it off, but the meaning wasn't lost on him. He was being warned, and not just about the Union. By early 1975, the tension was boiling over. Hoffa's campaign to reclaim the Teamsters presidency was in full swing. He was working the phones, locking down delegates, promising reform. He spoke about bringing the Union back to its roots, fighting for workers, not laundering mob money. And he did it all with the same bulldog confidence that had once made him unstoppable. But he was also surrounded by ghosts. Sam Giancana was dead, shot in his own kitchen. Johnny Roselli was floating in a drum in Biscayne Bay. Men with secrets, men who had done work for the government and the mob, were disappearing one by one. The message was clear. Anyone who talked too much would never talk again. Frank Sheeran saw the signs. It was like watching someone walk towards a cliff, he later said. Everyone could see where it was going but Jimmy. Or maybe he saw it too and didn't care. Hoffa was too angry to back down. He'd given his life to the Teamsters. He'd taken beatings, jail time, and humiliation for the cause. He'd outlasted presidents and prosecutors. He wasn't about to let a second-rate figurehead and a crew of gangsters steal what he'd built. But the men he was challenging weren't politicians or businessmen. They were killers. And in their world, betrayal, real or perceived, was paid for in blood. By the summer of 1975, a decision had been made. Hoffa had become too dangerous to be allowed to speak. If he returned to power, he could tear open everything they'd built. If he testified under oath, he could drag half the underworld, and maybe parts of the government, into the light. They had made him once. Now they would unmake him. On July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa drove to the Matchus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, outside Detroit. He was supposed to meet Tony Provenzano and Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone to discuss his comeback and the future of the Union. They were late. Hoffa paced the parking lot, growing angrier by the minute. At some point that afternoon, a car pulled up. Hoffa got in. He was never seen alive again. The investigation that followed was a circus. Witnesses contradicting each other. Bodies dug up from empty fields. Tips leading nowhere. The FBI called it the most extensive search in its history. It didn't matter. Hoffa had vanished into the same dark river that had swallowed Colombo, Gallo, Giancana, and Roselli. Frank Sheeran later claimed he was the one who pulled the trigger. He said Russell Bufalino gave the order, and that Hoffa walked into the house on Beaverland Street in Detroit thinking it was a peace meeting. Sheeran said he shot Hoffa twice behind the ear, quick and clean, and left before the body was taken away. No forensic evidence ever proved it, but no one credible ever offered a better explanation. In the end, the man who once held America's most powerful union in his fist died as so many men in his world did, without ceremony, without a grave, and without a single person willing to admit what happened. Hoffa's disappearance wasn't just the end of a man. It was the end of an era. The world of smoke-filled backrooms and handshake deals between Labour and the mob was collapsing under RICO indictments and Senate hearings. The House Select Committee's work would eventually expose just how deep the roots of conspiracy ran, from Castro plots to Dallas, but it came too late for Jimmy Hoffa. The mob had reclaimed the house and painted over the blood. Russell Bufalino remained the invisible hand, pulling strings from the shadows. Frank Fitzsimmons died in office, still the amiable caretaker of a union far removed from the street fights and picket lines that birthed it. And Frank Sheeran lived out his days carrying secrets too heavy to name, until the end. Jimmy Hoffa, the coal miner's son who rose to become the most powerful labor leader in America, ended his life as a ghost, swallowed by the very forces he once thought he controlled. The men who built him decided he had become a liability, and in their world, liabilities disappear. It was the final, unspoken rule of their universe. If they could make you, they could unmake you. And on that July afternoon in 1975, that's exactly what they did. He always kept a pad by the phone. It wasn't sentiment, it was habit. Names went there, times, plate numbers, one-word reminders that only made sense to the man who wrote them. On the pad by the kitchen phone at Lake Orion, in a scuffed yellow ruled block, 2 pencil marks sat like fingerprints on glass. Russ. Frank. The names weren't underlined. They didn't need to be. If Jimmy Hoffa was going to meet Tony Provenzano for a real sit-down, one that wasn't just another insult disguised as a calendar appointment, then Russ and Frank had to be there. That was the condition. Not spoken in so many words, not on a line that could be played back in a courtroom, but clear. Russell Bufalino, the quiet Sicilian who never raised his voice, yet moved men like chess pieces. Frank Sheeran, the tall Irishman who'd been at Jimmy's shoulder for a decade, as close to family as anyone outside the house could be. If Tony Pro wanted peace, he would have to face the two men who understood Jimmy best, and who understood the score even better. The man lining up the day was Tony Giacalone, the Detroit diplomat in a silk shirt. Tony Jack had already tried to pry something out of Hoffa. Papers, the kind that could make an FBI file go quiet. Jimmy wouldn't give them up. Even so, they still dealt. In a town where every handshake carried a motive, Tony Jack was the last person Jimmy would have called a friend, and the first one he'd have trusted to arrange a meeting that wouldn't end in a circus. 1 week earlier, a federal jury had come back the way Russell liked them to come back. Not guilty. The extortion case out of Buffalo had collapsed under its own weight and the weight of its witnesses. In the soft afterglow of an acquittal, phones lit up. Russell called fewer people than you'd think. He preferred to receive, but word travelled, and with it a pressure you could feel through the wire. The kind of pressure that makes a man either heed a warning or walk into it. On Sunday, July 27th, the phone on Frank Sheeran's kitchen wall in Philadelphia started its quiet ring. Frank answered with his shoulder the way men do who've spent a lifetime talking while doing something else. The voice on the other end didn't waste breath. They talked in curves and corners, not straight lines. No names, no addresses. Wedding was the one clean noun they used, and even that was a decoy everyone understood. Bill Bufalino's daughter was getting married on Friday, August 1st, in Detroit. 500 people, maybe more. All the families. Everyone important would be there. Some in the open, most in the wallpaper. You couldn't move through the ballroom without brushing a shoulder that could change your life. Jimmy wasn't going to the wedding. He said Joe didn't want people stirring. He meant Zerilli, the old boss who preferred his name to be a rumor. But the wedding was the tent pole in the middle of the week. It held up the canvas. It gave cover to every face moving toward Michigan, and every errand tucked into those movements. Frank said what he was allowed to say. He and his friend were driving out to the wedding. Jimmy laughed through his nose. He knew who the friend was. You didn't say Russ over a line in 1975. You didn't say Frank either. You said friend, and you trusted that both of you could read. What Frank couldn't say was the part that mattered most to him. He was trying to stop it. He wasn't in on a plan. He was praying there was still room for one to change. Men like Frank didn't pray out loud. They made a call, then made a drive, and somewhere in the middle hoped for mercy without naming it. To outsiders, the sight of 3,000 people rising in tuxedos to applaud Frank Sheeran at the Latin Casino the previous October looked like a long toast to a life of labor. Inside the room, it was understood as something else. A roll call. The mayor. The DA war buddies. Old Teamsters. A scatter of men the FBI would later connect across charts with red string. And at the center table, Jerry Vale crooning Spanish Eyes, as if the song had been written for Russell Bufalino's smile. Jimmy had flown in for that night. He'd fastened a heavy gold watch around Frank's wrist, diamonds winking in the stage lights. A gift, but more than a gift. A benediction. "I never realized you were that strong," Hoffa told him, and if anyone else in the country had said it, Frank would have brushed it off. Coming from Jimmy, the words carried a freight only the two of them could weigh. Later, Russell eased a small velvet box across the linen and opened it. A ring. A $3 gold piece crowned with diamonds, sized for a knuckle made by work. There were only 3 in the world, and Frank wore his even in an assisted living bed. On his other hand, a ring with his daughter's birthstones, which told a different story about the kind of man he had been before the world taught him what he needed to know. At Broadway Eddie's after the speeches, they ate at a small table shoved to the side of a room they had to themselves, not because the owner loved them, but because he understood the city he lived in. Russell, Angelo, Jimmy, Frank. The air there had a density that made waiters talk softer. Russell asked a question that wasn't really a question. "What are you running for?" He let it settle long enough that a lesser man might have begun to answer twice. "My union," Jimmy said. "It's mine. I built it." "You don't need the money," Russell replied, and his voice had no judgment in it, just the edge of arithmetic. Then he leaned a millimeter and gave the line that stayed lodged like a fishhook in Frank's memory. "There are people higher than me who think you're showing a lack of appreciation for Dallas." The words didn't reach volume. They didn't need to. Everyone at that table understood Dallas didn't mean Texas barbecue. It meant a scene most people were willing to leave unpicked for the rest of their lives. Jimmy sat back with that bull look he got when he decided you were wrong, and he would outlive the consequences. "I'm not letting Fitz have the union," he said. "Nobody scares Hoffa." After, in the car, Russell pinched Frank's cheek, a small act that could feel like a christening or a condolence depending on the night. "Talk to your friend," he said. "Tell him what it is." That was October. This was July. The calendar hadn't budged in the direction Frank hoped. Monday night, July 28th. Old Forge, Pennsylvania. Bruticos, veal and peppers, spaghetti marinara, broccoli rabe. Russell cooked when a place didn't meet his standard. This place did. He was in his 70s now, but the only concession time had wrung from him was a lazy eye that made his smile look like it was winking. The other eye stayed sharp enough to slice a room cleanly into allies and problems. The owner leaned in to murmur something, and Russell rose without apology. There were no portable phones, only back hallway receivers mounted on walls beside wire shelves stacked with bleach and napkins. He was gone 3 minutes. When he returned, he didn't sit right away. He studied Frank the way a carpenter studies a board before he decides which side to show the room. "We got a little change in plans," Russell said finally. "We're not leaving tomorrow. We stay put until Wednesday morning." Frank didn't blink. The news came in like shrapnel. He didn't let it show on his face. If you lived long enough, you learned to let your blood carry the heat while your eyes stayed level. Russell let silence do its work, then added, gentle as a man guiding a child across a street. "Your friend was too late. There's no need for you and me to meet him on Saturday by the lake." There it was. No anger. Not even disappointment. Just a pivot. An invisible meeting had already been held in another room. Maybe not a real room. Maybe just a chain of calls between men who didn't need to sit down to agree. And the result had been passed down the line. Frank was not going to be in Detroit on Wednesday afternoon. The women would be dropped at a diner. There would be a pilot waiting, a quick fly over the lake, a small errand in Detroit, and a return. When you were finished, you went back for dessert. You took a leisurely drive into Michigan. At the wedding, you ate prime rib and pretended there were no empty chairs. Frank leaned forward until his shoulders nearly touched the linen. He didn't ask questions. You didn't ask questions. You borrowed language that felt like nothing and loaded it until it sank. "The nuclear fallout," he said softly, the words catching a little on the old stutter. "It's going to hit the fan. Jimmy's got records put away. If something unnatural happens to him..." Russell's thumb worked the tablecloth like he was grinding out a cigarette invisible to everyone else. He didn't look down. He didn't have to. Your friend made one threat too many in his life. "I'm just saying," Frank tried again. "When they find his body..." "There won't be a body," Russell said. The thumb kept moving, slow circles. Dust to dust. That was all of it. Theology and logistics in 3 words. The men who burned cities for a living never spoke louder than they needed to. Frank sat back, sipped coffee sweetened with sambuca, and nodded as if a small plan had been agreed to about a small problem. That night at the Howard Johnsons', Frank stared at the ceiling and kept his hands flat on the bedspread. If he tried to call Lake Orion, he wouldn't make it to his car. Russell had taught him 100 lessons. The first was timing. The second was stillness. Wednesday, July 30th. Telegraph Road, late morning turning to early afternoon, wide lanes glossed with sun. Jimmy eased his 1974 Pontiac into the lot outside the Matchus Red Fox, with that old driver's patience he'd learned in the days when he'd delivered packages nobody looked at too long. He was early. He was nearly always early. He got out. He checked his watch. He paced. The meeting had been set for 2:30 p.m. Tony Pro was to be there. So was Tony Jack. The story carried by men to other men said it was peace, or something you could hold up in public as peace. The side story, the one only a few had permission to repeat, said the wedding on Friday made today possible. Everyone important was on the move, which meant nobody's movement meant anything. A thing that couldn't be done in a normal week could be done in the shadow of a banquet hall. Somewhere east, on a 2-lane road with a metal guardrail winking between trees, a car carrying Frank and Russell and their wives rolled toward a restaurant with a payphone. They would pull in. The women would be settled in a booth with a pot of coffee and a piece of pie that left a stain on the china. The men would step away for 15 minutes that lasted an hour. A small plane would rise off a small airstrip and make a quick, slow loop over Lake Erie, the water below as blank as a closed eye. Men who measured distances with their feet would cover more in 20 minutes of propeller time than they could in 2 days of driving. Then back down, back into the car, back to the booth, back to the road. Nothing happened. In the lot at the Red Fox, nothing happened for 20 minutes, then 30, then more. Hoffa called home to say the party hadn't shown. He reminded himself he was not the kind of man who waited for other men. A car turned in. Jimmy glanced up. He recognized the silhouettes through the windshield, and his shoulders let go of an inch of tension he'd been pretending he didn't carry. He didn't get into cars with men he didn't trust. He was not careless. He was not naive. He was a man who had memorized the rules before he wrote them down for other people. On this point, there was no debate. If he got in, it was because he knew the driver. Back at Lake Orion, the yellow pad waited next to the phone. The pencil marks didn't fade just because the house was empty. In the world he'd helped build, everything was a test. First, they would see if he would come alone. Then they would see if he would get in. If he passed those 2, there weren't any other tests left to give. The thing about a decision made in another room is that by the time you hear it, it's already been carried out. Not by fate, by men who didn't use words like fate when a word like order worked just as well. What they hadn't accounted for, or maybe what they had counted on and accepted, was how it would look. The call to the wife from a parking lot. The car found unlocked, untampered with. The rumor that the Bloomfield cops were asking around about Giacalone met immediately by a denial that landed like a glove on a table. That's absolutely untrue. The national cameras finding local 299's file of bombings and beatings and shotgun windows. Television anchors learning to say Marcus Red Fox as if they'd been going there for years. On Friday, August 1st, they would ask Anthony Giacalone questions into microphones. He would float like a man who knew how to float. Governor Milliken would give a comment that he didn't commit to anything. Fitzsimmons would issue a statement that read like a prayer he hadn't learned by heart. And at the wedding in Detroit, under chandeliers bright enough to blind a guilty man, people would raise champagne flutes and say mazel and auguri, and talk about the food, as if food were just food. None of that was Wednesday's business. Wednesday's business was simple. A car arrived. Hoffa got in. The door closed. The rest belonged to the men who do their work in rooms with no windows and come out holding nothing you can see. Frank didn't know every step. He knew enough. He knew that the people who wanted him in Detroit that night did not want him there that afternoon. He knew respect still counted for something in a world where respect and fear had become interchangeable. He knew that when Russell pinched your cheek, it could mean hello or goodbye, and sometimes it meant both. When they reached the city limits, Frank looked at the skyline and felt the ache behind his eyes that comes when a man has to fold one part of his life into the other, like a shirt that no longer fits. He didn't ask Russell if the errand had gone the way it needed to go. He didn't need to. Some things you don't confirm, you carry. The notepad sat where it sat. The pencil marks kept their shape. In houses like that, nobody throws out paper until they're sure they don't need it anymore. What followed, the press conferences, the digs in empty fields, the informants contradicting one another with equal confidence, belongs to a different chapter. This one ends where it's supposed to end, with the last clean details before everything turns to fog. A call on Sunday, a dinner on Monday, a change of plans, 2:30 at the Red Fox, a car door. Silence. The rest of it, the wedding, the plane, the sambuca cooling in its cup, the thumb grinding an invisible ash into a white cloth. That's how men remember a week when they have to live with it for the rest of their lives. If you want the short version, Russell already gave it at a table in Old Forge while the plates were being cleared. Dust to dust. Detroit, July 30th, 1975. James R. Hoffa, 62, former president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, leaves Bloomfield Township expecting a sit-down. The time on the record drifts between clocks. He's last seen around 2:45 p.m. At 2:15 p.m., he has already called his wife, Josephine, at the Lake Orion house. By 3:30 p.m., he's on the phone to an old rival-turned-friend, Louis the Pope Linteau, saying the man who arranged the meeting never showed. The restaurant is the Matchless Red Fox. The appointment was set for 2 o'clock. Hoffa never comes home. The family is scattered. His son, James P. Hoffa, 33, a Detroit attorney with a wife and 2 kids, is up in Traverse City on vacation. He will be the steady one with agents, handing over names and habits, doing what he can. Josephine, 60, had been in Miami from July 20th to 28th and is back in Michigan when her husband vanishes. Their daughter, Barbara Crancer, 37, is in suburban St. Louis with her husband, Robert. Everyone learns about the Red Fox, the missing hours, the unfinished meeting. In Detroit, there is a short list of men who could arrange a meeting like that, or cancel it permanently. First is Charles L. Chucky O'Brien, 41. Hoffa raised him, brought him into the Union, kept him afloat. O'Brien calls Tony Giacalone Uncle Tony and talks fast, too fast. He's known as a habitual liar by Teamsters brass and the Detroit outfit alike. In the week before Hoffa disappeared, O'Brien was getting rides to work from the Red Fox lot. A wealthy industrialist, Marvin Azell, had let him live in his home for a year and a half and dropped him at that lot. A Teamster business agent, Robert Holmes Jr., roughly 42, then drove him to work daily. O'Brien will later say he was driving a car belonging to Tony Giacalone's son, Joseph, 23, on the afternoon Hoffa went missing. The Giacalones anchor the street end of Detroit's La Cosa Nostra. Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, 57, is the field lieutenant, the man who was said to have set the Red Fox meet with Hoffa for July 30th, and the man who didn't show. He's married into the Provenzano name, likely kin to the New Jersey captain who once did time with Hoffa. Tony Jack floats an alibi, the Southfield Athletic Club that afternoon. His brother, Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, 53, is another lieutenant. He was with Tony on July 26th when the July 30th meeting got set. And then he disappeared from view on the day Hoffa vanished. There are men in Detroit considered more likely to do the hard part. Raffaele Jimmy Q. Quasarano, 66, an older hand with a violent past, is named by sources as someone who could carry out the murder itself. If Quasarano is in, his associate Paul Vitale, 68, is not far behind. Violence inside and around the union has a teamster face as well. Roland McMaster, 61, once the Secretary-Treasurer of Local 299 under both Hoffa and Frank Fitzsimmons. Fresh out of prison, McMaster landed back inside the machine as administrative assistant to the Local 299 president. He's suspected in multiple acts of muscle during organizing drives. These are the Detroit names. But the grudge that never died lives across state lines. Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, 58, a New Jersey captain and Local 560 officer, shared Lewisburg with Hoffa. They came out with a falling out that everyone knows about. Tony Pro keeps a circle. Stephen Andretta, 42, trusted and talkative, tells a Newark source named Ralph Picardo that he didn't touch Hoffa. He stayed in Newark to give Tony Pro an alibi. Stephen is on his way to a Detroit federal grand jury after 6 weeks in the Milan prison for contempt. His brother Thomas Andretta, 38, is a tighter man. Newark sources place him in the actual disappearance. The Brigilio brothers, both loyal to Tony Pro, Salvatore Sal, 45, and Gabriel Gabe, 36, are also named by Newark as hands on the job. There's another name that moves quietly between states. Francis Joseph Frank Sheeran, 43, president of Local 326 in Wilmington, Delaware, living in Philadelphia and close to Russell Bufalino, the boss of Eastern Pennsylvania. A car tied to Sheeran is spotted at a La Cosa Nostra gathering in Wilkes Barre on August 29th, and again in Detroit on December 4th, when New Jersey Teamsters parade through a federal grand jury. Sheeran is known to be in Detroit when Hoffa disappears and is considered Hoffa's friend. With him, friendship and work often traveled together. Linteau, the Pope, is a Pontiac operator who used to be Hoffa's enemy and lately his best friend. He owned airport service lines, ran Local 614 once upon a time, and by his account took that 3:30 p.m. call from Hoffa. Tony Giacalone's a no-show. The meeting's blown. Linteau moves everywhere with a business partner, Cynthia Green, 37, who knows the family, knows Josephine, knows the rhythms. She supports parts of Linteau's story, but her clock doesn't always match his. The Detroit chain of command sits above all this like a seal. Anthony Joseph Tony Zerilli, 48, is the underboss reputed to run the outfit's day-to-day, except he's cooling in Sandstone Federal Prison. Sources say nothing big in Detroit happens without his okay. His father, Joseph Zerilli, 78, is the boss in name and blood. He's old, said to be slipping, but his word still travels. In Tony Zerilli's absence, Giacomo Jack Tocco, 56, mines the city, reportedly taking orders from Tony through the wire. The official Union world is its own battlefield. Frank E. Fitzsimmons, 65, rose in the years Hoffa was inside. He is the international president now, and no friend to the man who once appointed him caretaker of the whole operation. Joseph Bain Sr., roughly 50, heads Local 614 in Pontiac and is close to Lanto. He isn't known as tight with Hoffa, but he plants himself in the Hoffa house for the first week after the disappearance, a presence more than a comfort. The federal grand jury in Detroit becomes the stage where everyone is called to speak, or to keep their mouths shut. Linteau, Green, Sheeran, they testify. Others take the fifth by posture or by silence. O'Brien, Tony Jack, Billy Jack, Jimmy Q, Vitale, Holmes, Bain, They appear and refuse to give answers. The Andretta and Briguglio names get hauled in for a lineup and are asked nothing at all. Tony Zerilli, from behind walls, twice refuses to testify and finally reads from a prepared statement. By then the outline is hard and simple. Hoffa is drawn to the Red Fox by men who speak the language of meetings and truces. His household is out of position, a son up north, a daughter in St. Louis, his wife trying to retrace his steps by phone records and hearsay. O'Brien orbits the restaurant lot, living under a Zell's roof, catching rides from Holmes, sliding behind the wheel of a Giacalone son's car. The Detroit lieutenants set the time. The New Jersey crew carries the old resentments and the muscle. Overall, of it hangs the rule of the Zerillis and the supervision of Jack Tocco, a system in which no Detroit hit goes forward without a nod. The case file calls it a disappearance. The men it lists tell a different story, one the city already understands. A meeting is promised. A man of power waits. Phones ring. Alibis harden. And by the time evening comes, the boss who once ran the biggest union in America is gone. Erased between 2:15 and 3:30, somewhere beyond the Red Fox parking lot, in a city where favors and feuds are settled the old way, and everyone who knows anything has already learned how to say nothing. The story of James R. Hoffa's disappearance doesn't start in the Red Fox parking lot. It starts in the weeks and months before, in the quiet shuffle of cars and conversations, the kind that mean everything when you know where to look. By the summer of 1975, Hoffa had been out of prison 3 years and was still trying to claw his way back into the union that had once been his kingdom. He was angling to reclaim the Teamsters presidency from Frank Fitzsimmons, the man he had handpicked as his caretaker, and he believed he could still pull it off. But the old alliances weren't the same. Men who once took his calls now barely returned them. Those who did were split between loyalty and fear. The FBI files read like a ledger of small moves leading to a single point. On July 26th, 4 days before Hoffa vanished, Tony and Vito Giacalone, the Giacalone brothers who controlled Detroit's streets for the Zerilli family, met Hoffa at a place called Southfield Athletic Club. That's when the Red Fox meeting was set. 2 o'clock, July 30th. The subject was making peace, or so they said. To Hoffa, that sounded like a door cracking open. He knew Tony Jack Giacalone. They'd talked before, and Tony was a man who could speak for the outfit, or at least arrange a path to the people who could. Hoffa told people he trusted that the meeting would change things. But there were other forces circling. Anthony Tony Provenzano, the New Jersey captain Hoffa once called a friend, was still holding a grudge from their shared time in Lewisburg. They'd gone from allies to enemies, their break so public that word of a shouted threat in a prison yard still echoed in FBI interviews. Tony Pro had promised Hoffa he'd tear his guts out if he ever crossed him again. Hoffa dismissed it as prison talk. But people who knew Tony Pro said he meant every word. Around Hoffa, the familiar faces began to behave strangely. Chucky O'Brien, the man Hoffa had raised like a son, was driving a car linked to Tony Giacalone's son the day Hoffa vanished. In the week before July 30th, O'Brien was being dropped off near the Red Fox by Marvin Azell, a wealthy industrialist who let him stay in his home. Another man, Teamster business agent Robert Holmes Jr., was ferrying O'Brien to work from that same parking lot. It was an odd pattern, one that would look different in hindsight. Even Linto, Hoffa's closest confidant, played a small but pivotal role. At 3:30 p.m. on July 30th, Hoffa called him from a payphone near the restaurant. Tony Giacalone was a no-show, he said. The meeting wasn't happening. Linto would repeat that story to investigators, but his girlfriend, Cynthia Green, who knew Hoffa's family well, gave a timeline that didn't always match his. Small cracks in the story, but enough to catch an investigator's eye. And then there were the men from out of state, the ones who didn't belong in Detroit except for something big. Stephen and Thomas Andretta, loyal to Tony Pro, had their names whispered by Newark informants as part of the team sent to deal with Hoffa. Sal and Gabe Bergoglio, Provenzano's muscle, were mentioned in the same breath. One source, Ralph Picardo, a New Jersey informant, told the FBI that Stephen Andretta claimed he'd stayed in Newark to give Tony Pro an alibi. A neat move that left the field clear for the others. Frank Sheeran, the tall Irishman who'd run errands and worse for Russell Bufalino, was in Detroit too. Sheeran was close to Hoffa, close enough to make him feel safe, but his loyalty was always layered. Investigators placed a car tied to Sheeran at a mob gathering in Wilkes Barre in late August, and again in Detroit in December, when the New Jersey crew showed up for a federal grand jury. Sheeran's name kept surfacing, but never with hard evidence attached. Behind all of it loomed Detroit's Mafia hierarchy. Tony Zerilli, the underboss who said to run day-to-day operations, was in federal prison but still passing orders. His father, Joe Zerilli, the aging boss, was said to be slipping but not silent. And Giacomo Jack Tocco was watching Detroit for the family in Tony's absence. Every credible source told the Bureau the same thing. Nothing big happened in Detroit without their blessing. On the Union side, Frank Fitzsimmons kept his distance, but his shadow hung over every move Hoffa made. He wasn't going to hand the presidency back. And while Fitzsimmons didn't have the kind of men who make people disappear, he didn't need to. There were others willing to handle that kind of work. The days after Hoffa vanished unfolded like a chessboard clearing. Linto, Green, and Sheeran testified before the Detroit grand jury. O'Brien, Tony Jack, Billy Jack, Quasarano, Vitale, Holmes, and Bain all took the stand and refused to answer questions. The Andretta brothers and Bergoglios were paraded through a lineup, but never asked a word. From prison, Tony Zerilli refused twice to testify, then finally read from a prepared statement. What the Bureau pieced together from surveillance, sources, and testimony was a story told in fragments, a meeting set by men who controlled Detroit streets, a power struggle that reached across state lines, old grudges, new betrayals, a car borrowed under false pretenses, alibis that locked into place too quickly, and a 62-year-old labor boss who believed he was going to broker peace, and instead vanished without a trace. Nobody was found. No charges were filed. But by the fall of 1975, investigators could see the outline clearly. Hoffa had walked into a meeting arranged by people he trusted and never walked out. The order had likely come from above, with nods exchanged between Detroit and New Jersey. The job itself was done by men who knew how to make a body disappear, and a story vanish with it. Every witness had their story. Every suspect had an alibi. And behind all of them, the same old structure stood. The outfit, the families, the men who moved the pieces but never touched them. In the Bureau's files, the case was labeled Hoffex. On the street, it was something else entirely. A message. And the message was simple. James R. Hoffa had tried to step back into power. The men who already held it had stepped in first. By the time Hoffa vanished, the story had already narrowed around a few names. And one of them was Louis Lanto. In the days and hours surrounding July 30th, Lanto's version of events would become one of the most picked-apart timelines in the entire case. And for good reason. He was one of the last people Hoffa tried to reach. Linto told investigators that after leaving his airport service lines office that afternoon, he went out with Cynthia Green and Joe Bain Sr., president of Local 614. They stopped by an outdoor entertainment center around 5:30 p.m. to discuss labor issues, he said. He returned home briefly, then back to ASL around 10 p.m. What he didn't see, according to him, was any message from Hoffa. Worried, Linto called Hoffa's house. Josephine Hoffa answered, She hadn't heard from her husband since a 2:15 p.m. phone call, and she was beginning to panic. Linto said he'd do some checking. He claimed he tried paging Hoffa at the Machus Red Fox and got nothing, then called Bain to alert him. Later, when Bain denied ever receiving that call, Linto changed his story, saying maybe he hadn't called after all. What he did admit to was calling Anthony Giacalone at what he believed was Giacalone's son's home, telling him Hoffa was missing and pressing him for answers. Giacalone denied everything. After that, Linto called Green and told her to head to the Hoffa residence. He arrived a little after 11 p.m., and the three, Linto, Green and Mrs. Hoffa, stayed up through the night, waiting. By 7:15 a.m. on July 31st, with no word and no sign of Hoffa, Linto left to search for Hoffa's car. He found the green Mercury Marquis in the Matches parking lot and called Green from a nearby payphone. Then he returned to ASL and started making calls, one to the police, another to Bain, and finally to James P. Hoffa, who was in Traverse City. But the deeper investigators dug, the more Linto's timeline frayed. Bain told the FBI the first and only call he got from Linto came the next morning, when Linto said he'd found Hoffa's car. Josephine Hoffa told agents Linto never lifted a finger to check anything that night, and Linto's reputation, a notorious con man who'd do anything for a buck, didn't help his credibility. Agents began to suspect he might have known more than he was saying. Maybe Hoffa had told him about the planned July 30th sit-down with Giacalone and Tony Provenzano. Maybe he even knew he was expected at the Red Fox. Investigators noted that Linto controlled everyone at ASL. Employees admitted that if Linto told them to say something, they said it. One even told the FBI that they'd say anything Linto tells them to. That made him both unreliable and indispensable, a man whose testimony couldn't be ignored but couldn't be trusted either. What happened at Matches Red Fox that day became the focal point. It was a middle-class restaurant in one of Oakland County's most affluent neighborhoods, an unlikely place for a mob hit. At 2 p.m. on July 30th, Hoffa was there. 6 witnesses placed him in the vicinity, 5 of whom spoke with him. One remembered Hoffa mentioning that Josephine was about to undergo cataract surgery, a fact unknown to the public, confirming the sighting. All said he was waiting for someone. None saw who he left with. Investigators combed through everything: reservation books, receipts, credit card slips, cash register tapes, even timestamps from the kitchen showing when meals were ordered and served. They interviewed every employee, canvassed nearby shops and homes, and even reviewed the parking lot layout. The search turned up almost nothing. No signs of a struggle, no vehicle descriptions, no witnesses who saw Hoffa leave. One person did place Salvatore Briguglio, Tony Pro's trusted soldier, in the parking lot that day. It wasn't enough to build a case, but it was one more thread connecting the New Jersey crew to Detroit. The FBI's conclusion was grim but precise. Hoffa had likely arrived at the Red Fox between 2 and 2:15 p.m. and was last seen between 2:45 and 2:50. Investigators believed he was not physically abducted inside the restaurant. He probably left willingly, believing he was going to a second location to continue the meeting. From there, he vanished. Detroit agents began re-interviewing everyone: restaurant staff, customers, drivers, anyone who might have seen something. They showed photographs, tightened timeframes, and cross-checked stories against the hard evidence from receipts and logs. The hope was that narrowing the window might jog a memory, that someone might recall a face, a license plate, a movement they'd dismissed as ordinary. None of it brought Hoffa back. The case that began as a missing persons investigation was already transforming into something else, something darker. The timeline was precise, the evidence was thin, and the silence from the men who mattered was absolute. Every sign pointed to a betrayal Hoffa never saw coming, orchestrated with precision and executed with professional calm. In the language of the street, Hoffa had gone in the wind. But for the agents piecing the story together, the meaning was clear. Someone had called a meeting, and someone had made sure he would never walk away from it. And by 2:50 p.m. on that warm July afternoon, James R. Hoffa, the man who once controlled America's most powerful union, had disappeared from the face of the earth. If Hoffa's story ends in the space between a car door opening and closing, then Charles "Chucky" O'Brien's story runs alongside it like a shadow. O'Brien had been close to Hoffa for decades, close enough that Hoffa treated him like a son. But by the summer of 1975, that bond had frayed. O'Brien's loyalties were questioned by nearly everyone, including Hoffa himself. And Fansuante's movements on the days before and after the disappearance became some of the most scrutinized of the entire investigation. The Bureau's work on O'Brien centered on three things: his relationship with Tony Giacalone, his use of Giacalone's 1975 Mercury, and his activities before, during, and after July 30th. Investigators interviewed him twice, on August 6th and August 18th, 1975. What emerged was a timeline littered with contradictions. O'Brien claimed that on July 28th, he was packing up his office at Teamsters headquarters in Detroit. He'd been reassigned to the Southern Conference in Florida. Marvin Azell, with whom O'Brien was living, dropped him near 15 Mile Road and Telegraph around 8 a.m. Robert Holmes Jr. picked him up shortly after and delivered him to the office. O'Brien said he stayed there all day and returned home with Azell that evening. The following day, July 29th, O'Brien repeated much the same story. Same start time, same location, same lack of detail about the trip home. He added that he had dinner with Azell that night. But by his August 18th interview, O'Brien revised the story. That afternoon he said Joe Franco took him to a golf outing at Meadowbrook Country Club around 1 p.m. He didn't play golf, he insisted, but was dropped at Arzel's around 5 p.m. A photograph surfaced of O'Brien and Franco together that afternoon, and another witness, William Rogers, placed him at the club between 8 and 10 p.m., far later than O'Brien had claimed. O'Brien said he called Tony Giacalone that evening, reaching him at Joey Giacalone's apartment. Tony told him he'd be at the Southfield Athletic Club all day on July 30th for a meeting and a haircut. There was no mention of Hoffa. On the morning of July 30th, O'Brien said Azell dropped him off at 8 a.m. near the same intersection. Holmes Jr. picked him up again, and he arrived at his office by 9 a.m. He told investigators he had planned to travel to Toronto for a Teamsters meeting, but decided against it, saying it would be a wasted day. Holmes Sr. claimed O'Brien never told him of the change and waited in vain for him at the airport. At 11:15 a.m., a secretary told O'Brien a 40-pound salmon had arrived by air freight, a gift from a friend to Holmes Sr. With the Union Station wagon unavailable, O'Brien borrowed Joey Giacalone's Mercury to deliver it. He said that while loading the box, about 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 1 foot deep, some of the pink liquid from the fish splashed on his white shirt. O'Brien put the box on the back floorboard of the Mercury and delivered it to the Holmes residence, though his estimated times varied wildly between interviews. Mrs. Viola Holmes recalled he arrived around 1:40 p.m. and left by 2:20 or 2:30 p.m. O'Brien admitted trying to call Tony Giacalone twice after leaving, but got no answer. He claimed he also tried Marvin Azell's office, but was told Azell was out. O'Brien noticed the fish box had leaked onto the seat and floor mat of the Mercury, so he drove to Jack's car wash, arriving around 2:15 and leaving by 2:40. He paid with a Teamsters Standard Oil card and also charged a gas purchase. The receipt, dated July 30th, showed no timestamp, and the car wash's records, destroyed shortly after August 1st as a matter of routine, offered no confirmation. Employee interviews turned up nothing. From there, O'Brien said, he went to the Southfield Athletic Club. In his first interview, he claimed to have arrived at 2:55 or 3 p.m. Later, he revised that to 2:15. He said he bypassed the reception desk looking for Giacalone, but the receptionist swore O'Brien never came in that day. O'Brien told investigators he met Giacalone either before or after his haircut, changing the order several times, and said he accepted 2 $100 bills from him as graduation gifts for his children. He claimed he left around 3:15 or 3:30 p.m., though in later interviews he shifted that time again to 2:30 p.m. After leaving the club, O'Brien said he drove Joey Giacalone's car to Joey's office. After about 10 minutes they both left, with O'Brien behind the wheel. He couldn't recall what time he arrived at his own office, though he said the receptionist had already left for the day. She told investigators she clocked out at 4:30 p.m. That afternoon, O'Brien called Teamster Joe Valenti for a ride to the car wash, where his own vehicle was being cleaned. On August 6th, he told the FBI they left at 5 p.m. and arrived around 5:10. Azel picked him up at 6:15. Later, on August 18th, he revised that too, saying he left before 5 o'clock and arrived at the wash at 5:45. Valenti told agents O'Brien called around 4 o'clock, or 4:10 requesting a lift, and they left at 4:30 or 4:35. After Azel got the car, they dined across the street. That night, O'Brien said, he and Azel ate Chinese food around 7:30 and returned home within an hour. He placed a long-distance call to his wife in Arkansas and received no incoming calls. On the morning of July 31st, O'Brien was back at his office by 9:30. A message from Barbara Ripchick awaited him. Hoffa had not come home, and Louis Linto wanted him to call. Linto told him the old man was missing. O'Brien phoned Hoffa's son, and both calls were logged around 2 p.m. He then rang Joey Giacalone for a ride. Joey picked him up around 2:30, and they drove to Joey's apartment. Tony Giacalone was there. Tony denied seeing Hoffa or having any appointment with him the previous day. O'Brien said Tony told him Linto had called, but that he knew nothing. O'Brien borrowed Azel's Lincoln and went to Hoffa's son's home in Troy around 6:15 p.m. to protect the family. He stayed until Hoffa's son left for his father's house. Around 11:30 p.m., Hoffa's son called asking to see him. By 2:30 a.m. on August 1st, O'Brien was back at Hoffa's son's home. Joe Bain Jr. was there too. Hoffa's son accused O'Brien of knowing more than he was admitting. O'Brien told investigators he felt Hoffa's son was acting like a prosecutor, so he left around 4:45 a.m. Before departing, he agreed to try to arrange a meeting with Tony Giacalone the next day. He called Tony later that morning, saying Hoffa's son wanted to talk. Tony replied that he'd do whatever he could, but denied again that any July 30th meeting had happened. O'Brien said he relayed Tony's willingness to meet, but Hoffa's son told him he and his sister would handle it themselves. He denied warning Giacalone that Hoffa's son was trying to set him up. That afternoon, O'Brien went to Joey Giacalone's apartment. Later, he said, he had dinner with Tony and Joey, Joey's wife, and a young woman believed to be Kyle Thornton. They drove Tony's Cadillac to the St. Clair Inn, 120 miles away. Detroit police surveillance noted Tony leaving at 5:50 p.m., but did not spot O'Brien with him. Interviews with inn employees and patrons placed neither man there between 7 and 9 p.m. The Cadillac returned to Detroit at 8:45 with unidentified passengers. On August 2nd, O'Brien called Tony again. Tony said he had a haircut appointment at the Southfield Athletic Club, where the barber shop adjoins the gym. O'Brien said they met there, and the barber confirmed both men were present. And just like that, the thread that might have led investigators closer to Hoffa's final hours dissolved into contradictions, revisions, and unverifiable claims. Chucky O'Brien's timeline, like so much else in the Hoffa case, was a shifting story with no fixed center. A moving target in a world where silence was often the loudest answer of all. The summer heat hung low over Detroit, the kind of slow, heavy air that made tempers short and secrets sweat through collars. By the time July bled into August 1975, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa was no longer just a local scandal. It was a national wound, festering with rumors and betrayals, drawing the attention of every lawman, mob boss, and teamster in America. The Bureau's investigation, sprawling and relentless, had already dragged into the light a parade of small-time hustlers, Union soldiers, and men whose names carried weight in smoky backrooms from Detroit to Newark. One by one they were questioned, followed, cornered. Some lied, most lied. A few said nothing at all. And at the center of it all, casting a shadow longer than the rest, was the Commission, the governing body of La Cosa Nostra. Their reach was everywhere. And if Hoffa's disappearance was a sanctioned act, the orders had likely come from above. The Bureau's attention first turned toward Russell Bufalino, the quiet don of northeastern Pennsylvania. Bufalino was no street enforcer, no headline-chasing gangster. He was a man who whispered, and men listened. His power was subtle, his reputation ironclad. Hoffa had known him for decades, trusted him even, which was precisely why agents believed Bufalino might have known what was to come. Bufalino's movements in the summer of '75 were carefully charted. Witnesses placed him traveling through Michigan in the days leading up to July 30th. He met with trusted lieutenants, broke bread with old associates. None of it, on paper, proved anything. Yet none of them felt innocent either. Bufalino's name surfaced again and again, spoken in cautious tones by informants and suspects alike. If Hoffa had been lured to that meeting under false pretenses, Bufalino almost certainly knew, and may have helped script the play. But Bufalino was not alone in the Bureau's sights. Carlos Marcello, down in New Orleans, the old lion of the Gulf Coast, had a stake in this too. Hoffa's return to power, if it ever happened, threatened more than just Detroit's rackets. It risked upsetting a delicate balance that stretched from Chicago's South Side to the New Jersey docks. A man like Hoffa back at the helm of the Teamsters could mean scrutiny, indictments, and shifts in the flow of money. Men like Marcello didn't gamble with those kinds of odds. Then there was Santo Trafficante, Tampa's quiet kingpin, and another architect of the American Mafia's boardroom. Trafficante was older, slower, but his mind remained sharp, and his network stretched deep into labor, gambling, and international finance. His name, too, surfaced in bureau chatter, linked by rumor and coded testimony to the broader scheme. If Hoffa's end was planned as part of a national decision, Trafficante would have had a seat at the table. The Bureau's intelligence department painted a picture of whispered conversations and subtle alignments. No single piece of evidence tied the commission directly to Hoffa's fate, but the pattern was unmistakable. Men from Detroit, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Florida, men who normally had little reason to coordinate, had all moved in quiet concert that summer. And above them all, like a spider in the center of a vast web, sat Anthony Tony Dux, Corallo of the Lucchese family in New York. Corallo rarely left the shadows, but his voice carried far. Wiretaps captured his associates speaking cryptically in the days after Hoffa vanished. Phrases like, "The thing is handled," and "the old man's not coming back." None of it was actionable. All of it was chilling. The Bureau's agents, seasoned men hardened by years chasing shadows, began to see Hoffa's disappearance not as an impulsive act of revenge or a local settling of scores, but as a decision, deliberate, collective, and final. It had the fingerprints of a commission action, careful planning, plausible deniability, and silence from every corner of the underworld. Yet, for all the suspicion, For all the hours spent interrogating witnesses and tailing suspects, the truth remained just out of reach. Every man called before the grand jury, Bufalino, Marcello, Trafficante, invoked the fifth. They denied knowing Hoffa, denied involvement, denied even hearing his name. They built walls of silence around themselves and dared the law break through. Still, the Bureau pressed on. Surveillance intensified. Informants were turned. And in the whispers that filtered back from bars and card rooms and back-alley diners, a narrative took shape. A story of betrayal not born in Detroit, but sanctioned in smoke-filled rooms hundreds of miles away. They said Hoffa had grown reckless, that his obsession with reclaiming the Union's throne had blinded him to the alliances forming against him. They said he ignored warnings, dismissed threats, believed himself untouchable. And they said that in the end, the decision was made not out of anger, but out of necessity, a business solution to a problem that would not go away. Whether Hoffa was buried beneath Detroit soil or burned to ash in some distant furnace, no one would say. But among those who knew the way of things, it was understood once the commission spoke, there was no appeal. And somewhere, in the silence that followed July 30th, 1975, Jimmy Hoffa ceased to be a man and became a message, a reminder that even the most powerful can vanish if they stand in the wrong men's way. By the summer of 1975, the investigation had shifted from rumor and testimony to the cold, stubborn realm of physical evidence. The Pontiac Grandville, green with a green vinyl top and registered in Michigan under license ERH 642, was located and identified as the vehicle James R. Hoffa had driven on July 30th. 24 latent fingerprints were lifted from its surfaces, 4 of them belonging to Hoffa himself. The rest were useless in their present state, smudged or partial, and comparisons against known suspects left 2 of the prints hanging in limbo, belonging to no one the Bureau could name. 9 days later, agents seized another car maroon 1975 Mercury with Michigan plates TMS 416, owned by Joseph Giacalone, the son of Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone. The car was of particular interest because Chucky O'Brien had admitted to driving it that afternoon. The search turned up 26 latent fingerprints and 2 palm prints. 10 matched O'Brien. 1 matched the agent who had seized the vehicle. The others, again, belonged to ghosts. In the trunk, a Remington Wingmaster 12-gauge shotgun lay nestled in a black case beside a box of double-aught buckshot. The glove compartment contained .38 and .22 caliber ammunition, and under the driver's seat, a black leather pistol holster. The prints and the weapons suggested a vehicle that was more than just transportation. But fingerprints alone do not tell stories, and the Mercury still had more to give. On August 13th, and again on August 15th, 3 German Shepherd scent dogs, veterans of numerous bureau cases, were brought in. All 3 reacted sharply to the rear right seat, indicating the presence of Hoffa's scent. 1 dog also alerted the trunk, though handlers cautioned that the scent could have drifted from the back seat. Still, both trainers agreed. At some point, Hoffa had been inside that vehicle. The Bureau's laboratory work followed. On September 19th, a single 3-inch brown hair was recovered from the rear seat backrest. Its characteristics were consistent with known Hoffa samples. A chemical test on the hair's surface produced a positive result for the presence of blood, but the amount was too small for further testing. It was a whisper of violence, not a declaration. 4 days after Hoffa vanished, his wife Josephine provided agents with a handwritten list of appointments she swore was in her husband's handwriting. The list, taped to the lampshade on his desk, included a dozen notes and reminders. Buried among them was a cryptic entry: TG 230 Wednesday 14-mile Tell Fox Rest Maple Road. Hoffa was known to tape important messages there, and this one was treated with care. It was initially believed the meeting was set for 2:30 p.m. though Hoffa himself told Louis Lenteau and others that the meeting was at 2 p.m. Whether Hoffa gave the wrong time to others or wrote it down incorrectly for himself remains unclear. The address itself was also wrong. 14 Mile Tell should have read 15 Mile, the actual location of the Mattress Red Fox restaurant. The words Maple Road were written in a different pen, suggesting that Hoffa later clarified the location or received updated instructions from someone else. He was last seen on the north side of the restaurant, where Maple Road ran, and his car was found parked on that side too. The note hinted at a meeting point, but it was unlikely to have been inside the restaurant itself. The Red Fox required jacket and tie. Hoffa wore neither that day. Everything suggested he was meant to wait outside. 4 months later, the investigation shifted focus from fingerprints and notes to faces. On December 4th, 1975, based on information from Newark sources, Thomas Andretta, Salvatore Briguglio, and Gabriele Briguglio were summoned before the Detroit federal grand jury and asked to voluntarily appear in a lineup. All three refused. A federal judge ordered their participation, and on December 6th, 3 separate lineups were held. 2 actual witnesses and 4 staged ones viewed the suspects. The key witness, Herbert Hall Odell, had earlier told agents he saw Hoffa in the right rear seat of a maroon Lincoln or Mercury near the Mattress Red Fox around 2 p.m. on July 30th. Odell had passed a polygraph and was considered truthful. Yet when shown the lineup, he was unable to identify any of the men as those he had seen in the car. In a follow-up interview on December 12th, he reviewed color photographs and again said he could neither confirm nor rule out any of the suspects. His statements grew inconsistent. He read the papers, and it looked like they were getting away with it, Odell said, a remark that made agents question whether he was trying too hard to help the investigation. Still, he did not retract his original statement, insisting that what he had seen was real and that he would testify to it under oath. Plans were made to re-interview him with another polygraph to test his reliability. The second witness, Marjorie Jane Bissayon, was interviewed on August 15th. She reported seeing a white male in a brown or maroon flashy car in the rear parking lot of the Red Fox around 2 p.m. On December 5th, she was contacted again and told agents she had just been about to call them after recognizing a photograph of Salvatore Briguglio in the newspaper. She believed Briguglio was the man she had seen that day. At the lineup, she picked him out without hesitation. The evidence from the eyewitnesses remained frustratingly thin. Odell might have been sincere but mistaken, his recollection muddied by time and news. Coverage Bissayon's identification was compromised by her prior exposure to Briguglio's photograph in the press. No defense attorney would hesitate to dismantle it. But investigators held out hope. If other physical evidence could place Briguglio at the Red Fox that afternoon, Bissayon's testimony could become the piece that tied it together. Attention then turned to a different figure entirely, Roland B. McMaster. A former officer with Detroit Teamsters Local 299 and, since 1970, a general organizer in Chicago and Detroit, McMaster's history was steeped in violence. Nearly every major act of intimidation and reprisal at Local 299 traced back to him or his associates. Just weeks before Hoffa vanished, a Local 299 business agent had been beaten, and Richard Fitzsimmons' Teamsters-owned automobile had been bombed on July 10th. McMaster had been transferred to Chicago after an earlier incident in which one of his men assaulted another Teamsters official during a dispute over expenses. But his influence in Detroit never waned, and his appetite for control over Local 299 remained. For investigators, that made him a suspect from the start. Sources told the Bureau that the Fitzsimmons bombing had been a diversion, a way to disguise Hoffa's disappearance as an internal Local 299 feud. The implication was chilling. Hoffa's vanishing had been staged as a reprisal killing to throw the investigation off its trail. The tip deepened the probe, and new suspects emerged: James Shaw, and Lawrence McHenry, known strong-arm men for Jack Torres, a close McMaster ally. The case remained open, with federal grand jury action expected, but delayed. One Indianapolis informant claimed that a man named Larry Young from Detroit had offered him $50,000 to kill Hoffa roughly a month before he disappeared. The same source later speculated that Young and a man named Don Wells had carried out the murder. Wells lived on a farm in Wixom, Michigan, owned by McMaster. Both Wells and Young were later arrested by Detroit FBI agents in a separate case involving stolen steel, but no corroborating evidence linked them to Hoffa's disappearance. The investigation also examined the possibility that Hoffa's body had been transported from Detroit by Gateway Transportation Company. One of Gateway's Detroit terminal managers, Stanton Bear, was both a close personal friend and the ex-brother-in-law of McMaster. No evidence tied Bear to the crime, but the connection underscored how tightly woven the web around Hoffa had become. Every thread the Bureau pulled seemed to lead back to men like McMaster, men who had the means, the motive, and the muscle to make Hoffa disappear. And so, the story tightened, not toward resolution, but toward a darker clarity, that what happened on July 30th, 1975, was no random act. It was a planned convergence of debts, betrayals, and old scores, carried out in daylight and buried in silence. The fingerprints and hair, the false addresses and botched identifications, the car bombs and whispered offers of money. All of it formed a picture, not yet whole but unmistakable in outline. James Riddle Hoffa had stepped into a trap that day, and nearly half a century later, the steel jaws of that trap still refused to open. They had chased every lead, followed every whisper, and sifted through every fragment of rumor and evidence. Yet the deeper they dug into the mystery of James R. Hoffa's disappearance, the clearer one brutal truth became. The motive for the hit was as tangled as the men who might have ordered it. The prevailing theory, the one that both confidential sources and Teamster insiders returned to again and again, was simple and deadly. Hoffa had been killed because he was trying to claw his way back into the throne he'd once held. He had told more than one confidant that he expected his restrictions to be lifted by August 1975. Even his family believed it. They'd heard him talk about the day he would return to the top of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. And if he did, if he once again became the man at the head of the table, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. Jimmy Hoffa would not be as pliable, as easily handled, as Frank Fitzsimmons had been. There was another, darker possibility. Some sources suggested that Hoffa had been preparing to testify about the deep rot within the Union, about the kickbacks, the payoffs, and the violations of federal labor law that had been its bloodstream for decades. There were whispers that he had already passed some information to someone in Washington, perhaps even the Justice Department. But whispers were all they were. No document, no witness, no scrap of hard evidence ever surfaced to confirm that Hoffa had provided or planned to provide such information. Still, the very idea that he might have was enough to make men in dark suits and darker corners nervous. And then there was the vendetta theory, blood and pride and old grudges that ran deeper than any contract. Tony Provenzano's name surfaced often in these conversations, the kind of enemy who never forgot a slight and never forgave a betrayal. It was entirely possible, investigators believed, that Hoffa's death had been a personal matter, retribution masquerading as business. If a hit had been ordered, and by this point almost no one doubted that one had, it likely bore the seal of approval from the highest levels of organized crime. That, more than anything, lent weight to the theory that Provenzano, or someone of his stature within the La Cosa Nostra and the Teamsters, had signed off on Hoffa's death. Yet for all the theories, one glaring fact remained. No one could prove whether Jimmy Hoffa was dead or alive. Time, however, is its own witness. And with each passing month, the possibility that he was still alive grew fainter. Men like Louis Lanto, who had known Hoffa well, clung to the belief that he might still be out there, somewhere. But even they had no explanation. No story to offer for why Hoffa would disappear, or where he could possibly hide for so long. And there was no reason, none at all, for him to have vanished voluntarily. It would have served no purpose. From the start, the FBI and the Detroit Strike Force cast a wide net. Between September 2nd and December 11th, 1975, 95 individuals appeared before the federal grand jury in Detroit, some more than once. Many of them invoked the Fifth Amendment and refused to testify. Most were either members of La Cosa Nostra or Teamster officials, and many were already under indictment or anticipating charges in unrelated cases. The reluctance to talk was palpable, the silence deliberate. On August 8, 1975, the Bureau seized a 1975 maroon Mercury registered to Joseph Giacalone, son of Detroit mob figure Tony Giacalone. That car, driven by Charles O'Brien on the day Hoffa vanished, had already become central to the investigation. O'Brien denied knowing anything, but the evidence told a different story. FBI technicians combed over the vehicle and collected fingerprints, hair samples, and other physical evidence. Giacalone's lawyers fought tooth and nail to get the car returned, even arguing the legality of the search before the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. But the Bureau held firm. The car remained in FBI custody, silent, impassive, but heavy with implication. Other fronts were less cooperative. On December 4th, 3 men with deep ties to the New Jersey Teamsters, Thomas Andretta, Salvatore Briguglio, and Gabriel Briguglio, appeared before the grand jury and refused to participate in a lineup. Hauled before Judge James P. Churchill, they were ordered to comply. They refused again and were briefly jailed for contempt before relenting under pressure from their attorney, William Bufalino. Even then, their cooperation was grudging and minimal. On December 11th, Andretta was remanded into U.S. Marshal custody for continued refusal to testify. He sat in jail for more than a month before agreeing to talk after the Sixth Circuit denied his appeal. Whether he told the whole truth when he finally opened his mouth remains an open question. The investigation faced obstacles at every turn. From the moment the story broke, the case was swarmed by national media, the appetite for any scrap of information relentless. Reporters hounded investigators, and leaks, some intentional, many not, found their way into print. Some of those leaks may have come from state or local police who had been the first to handle the case before the FBI took over. Others likely came from within the Teamsters themselves. It was not uncommon for information to reach Hoffa's own family before it reached the Bureau. Even more frustrating was the flood of well-meaning but worthless tips. Telephone calls, letters, anonymous leads. Each one had to be checked, each one a potential waste of time. Hours were burned chasing stories that led nowhere, and even the information that did point to suspects was often impossible to corroborate. Most of the people who knew anything of value were criminals themselves, their credibility compromised, their motives suspect. The few who testified before the grand jury said little that investigators didn't already know. Many were called too soon, before agents had a chance to fully vet or develop their statements. Jurisdiction added another layer of complexity. If Hoffa's body was ever found, prosecution would almost certainly fall to local authorities, not federal prosecutors. And without a body, the legal path forward was murky at best. Informants who might have broken the case open at higher levels either knew nothing or refused to speak. That silence suggested something chilling. The order to eliminate Hoffa had likely been sanctioned at the very top of the criminal hierarchy. Fewer people knew the truth than anyone had imagined. It was also possible though investigators considered it unlikely, that Hoffa's murder had been carried out by someone outside the traditional mob structure. Politics loomed over everything. The Teamsters were powerful, too powerful, and any investigation into their affairs inevitably collided with political pressure. When Senator Henry Jackson announced a search for Hoffa's body based on reliable information, it was clear that the case was as much a political weapon as a criminal one. Jackson, with presidential ambitions, had even enlisted Michigan's Attorney General to assist in the effort. And still the tips kept coming. Letters, phone calls, anonymous claims. Most were useless, but none could be ignored. Each one demanded time, manpower, and attention. Each one was a reminder that Hoffa's disappearance had become more than a missing person case. It was a national obsession, a story woven into the fabric of American power, corruption, and fear.